The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, the 15th of April 2024. Today we're looking at two areas of asylum support in the Home Office. One is the costs of the UK-Rwanda partnership, and the second is the government's long-term strategy for asylum accommodation. As people may be aware, in 2022 the government announced a partnership with the government of Rwanda to relocate some people seeking asylum to Rwanda if they arrive in the UK illegally. That's generally speaking on small boats. And under the partnership, the Home Office has agreed to pay significant sums of money to Rwanda, which this committee and our sister committee, the Home Affairs Select Committee, have been examining and had some interesting conversations with the Home Office about why and when we can receive information about that money. Thankfully, the National Audit Office has now dug into those figures and has been able to reveal exactly what the forward costs are for the Rwanda partnership. So we want to talk to the Home Office about those today. But by the end of 2024, the Home Office expects to have spent around £28 million on this partnership, regardless of how many asylum seekers have been sent. And on asylum accommodation, as many, all of us around this table know, many hotels are being used to house the numbers of asylum seekers coming. Obviously, that's not desirable in the long term, and the Home Office's solution has been to create large sites. But again, the National Audit Office has looked into that and highlighted some big concerns for us as a Public Accounts Committee, and indeed for our sister committee, about the cost of those sites and the readiness of them. So we want to ask questions about that. But in the year to March 2024, the Home Office expects to spend about £4.7 billion on asylum support, so that's including £3.1 billion on hotels for that year. So obviously significant sums, and we want to dig into those issues. I would like to welcome our witnesses and then make some introductions for visitors to our committee today. So from the Home Office, we have, of course, Sir Matthew Rycroft, the Permanent Secretary, Simon Ridley, the Second Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, Joanna, Rowland, the Director General of the Customer Services Group at the Home Office, and Dan Hobbs, again back with us, Director General of the Migration and Borders Group. I'd also very warmly want to welcome Dame Diana Johnson, Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, who's guesting with us today, and the Deputy Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Tim Lawton MP, who are very welcome to join us. And I have two members who wish to make declarations of interest. Olivia Blake, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I am the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Migration, and I am also a principal for the Refugee and Migration Policy Group, and my details are set out in my register of interest.
Thank you very much, Ms Blake. And Paula Barker, MP.
Yes, I just want to place on record that my son actually is employed via an agency contract to work on the backlog for asylum.
Thank you. So we have skin in the game. Thank you very much, Ms Barker, for that. Before we go into the main session, however, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of issues. We received an accounting officer assessment from you, Sir Matthew, about the sovereign borders programme, which is on this very subject. You sent it to us on the 27th of March, but it was actually agreed in the Home Office in June of last year, and it went through your Finance and Investment Committee in January of last year. So why the delay in getting that accounting officer assessment to Parliament?
Well, first of all, thank you, Chair, for this opportunity to discuss all these important issues with you again. That accounting officer assessment, as you say, was completed last summer, and it was up to ministers when to make that public, and they decided to make it public in March.
Okay, so but you're the accounting officer, it's your assessment. Are there any reasons from the accounting officer end of things on why there should have been or needed to be a delay of 9 months?
Well, it's an assessment which I keep under review. As you know, I update it whenever things change, and I think the publication of accounting officer advice or summaries thereof have to be agreed by the relevant ministers, which in this case would be the Home Secretary.
Okay, well, we've only seen the summary of this. Can we all have access to the full accounting officer assessment on the normal terms?
I think you can have access on the normal terms, but I think the normal terms include the Home Secretary, in the Home Office's case, being comfortable each time with that release.
Okay, we have certainly with other departments, when we ask to see the full accounting officer assessment, we don't usually hit a barrier of a minister's approval being necessary because, as you know, you're accountable to us on the Public Accounts Committee and to Parliament through us as an accounting officer. So you're saying that if you ask the Home Secretary and he says yes, we'll have the normal access?
Absolutely.
And of course, the National Audit Office has access anyway, so it might be worth reminding the Home Secretary of that we have ways of getting to it, but it would be helpful if we could see that. And if we could extend that invitation to senior members of the Home Affairs Select Committee, that would be helpful. But in terms of what it covers, you talk about it being constantly under review, but it doesn't cover, it only covers the Nationality and Borders Act, not the other legislation covering this area. Is there any reason for that?
The Nationality and Borders Act was the legislation in place at that time, and there are separate accounting officer advice, as you expect, for the Illegal Migration Act and, of course, for the Safety for Rwanda Bill, which is going through the House now. Okay,
so you're not planning to put that all together, given that they're dealing broadly with the same subject and there is a lot of bleed over in money and spend?
You're absolutely right that there is a lot of interrelationship between the different parts of this programme of activity, all of which is designed to stop the boats and deter illegal migration, putting their lives and those of others at risk. I make sure that there is accounting officer advice both on each individual part of that package of activity and on the totality. And I'll make sure that you have access to summaries as and when we publish them.
So you sent this to us on the 27th of March, roughly 9 months after it was agreed in the Home Office. Have you produced any other accounting officer assessments since June of last year that we haven't yet seen?
Not in relation to that piece of legislation, no.
Okay. What about in relation to the Rwanda bill and the illegal migration bill?
There is. Yes, there is accounting officer advice on all the things that we're about to talk about, including on all of the large sites, for instance, which I update quarterly. So there are sort of small packets of accounting officer advice, and then they add up to the totality of looking at a whole programme as well.
Okay, so what accounting officer assessments have you written that we have not yet seen? How many, for a start?
I mean, I can come back to you with a precise number, but I mean, it depends what you count as a separate piece of advice. I mean, I update, as I say, the accounting officer advice for each of these large sites, and there are 4 large sites in operation. I do each of those each quarter. So that would be 12 things since 9 months ago, just in relation to the large sites. And then there are other parts of the programme which receive their own accounting officer advice, all of which is private until summary is made public.
Well, you say that, but we've actually been on a bit of a drive as a Public Accounts Committee because there was a little bit of a backlog in some departments, and we are now expecting to see them when they're written, pretty much. I mean, within days or a week or so. Why is the Home Office not doing that and providing Parliament with information?
Well, I think the Home Office is doing that. I think the Home Office is...
You say there's 12 outstanding, potentially, that we have not seen.
Well, I think we have a formal obligation to provide you with summaries of that advice, and I have committed to update you more often than that whenever there is a substantive change to any significant piece of accounting officer advice, and I continue I will recommit to that today, Chair. But there are often assessments that are made behind the scenes where there is essentially continuity of judgment. Okay,
well, but yeah, we are, as a Public Accounts Committee, we do see things, if necessary, in reading room terms to make sure that we are here to hold you as accounting officer for taxpayers' money to account. And it's not unusual for us. Even during COVID, I was invited into departments to see accounting officer assessments in full, where we felt that was a necessity to do that. I have to say, the more we don't see them, the more we think we need to be seeing them. So, can you give us a bit more reassurance that you're going to actually provide information to Parliament through this committee?
Absolutely, Chair. So I will absolutely update you whenever there is a summary to be published. In addition, whenever there is a substantive change to any of the assessments, for instance, on the value for money of the Rwanda scheme or on the value for money of any of the large sites we're about to talk about, then I will commit to tell you and the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee. And finally, I will absolutely commit to doing what I have already done with the Home Affairs Select Committee, which is when there is commercially sensitive information, to see if the Home Secretary agrees that can be discussed in a private session, as we did with the Home Affairs Select Committee a month or two ago.
I have to say, with other departments, accounting officers just provide that information. It's not usually a big issue to have it signed off. I don't know if the Treasury Officer of Accounts would like just to say something here about what's normally expected by departments in providing accounting officer assessments to Parliament, and exactly what an accounting officer assessment is. It seems like there's a bit of a fudge here, Sir Matthew, about what you say an accounting officer assessment is and what we would expect.
Yes, I can assure you there's no fudge, Chair, and I look forward to hearing what the Treasury Officer of Accounts says.
Yes, as the committee knows, that projects in the GMPP, government's major project programme, there is a requirement to publish accounting officer assessments, including when there is a significant change. What I would say, I know that internally within departments, there can be formal accounting officer assessments and informal accounting officer advice. And it sounds like some of the things Sir Matthew's referring to is where he's had advice that has said nothing significant has changed. So in those circumstances, we would not expect a summary to be republished.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we would like some of this to see for ourselves whether there has been a significant change. I'm going to ask Olivia Blake just to come in here and then...
Just a couple of questions, really. Just going back to the assessment. Can I ask when the scheme itself, the programme itself, was last approved by your finance and investment committees?
It was approved last year, and then different parts of it get approved subsequently. So, for instance, when we are approaching a local authority to discuss a new large site, for instance, then there would be a separate approval by the investment committee at that stage.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And can I ask also if you believe that the programme still meets the 4 standards set out in managing public money?
Yes, with the exception of the value for money test in relation to the Rwanda parts of the scheme, which are covered by the ministerial direction.
But we haven't got a assessment that includes the Rwanda scheme in front of us, do we?
Well, there's separate accounting officer advice which the committee has seen in relation to the Migration and Economic Development Partnership with Rwanda.
Does the introduction of the Illegal Migration Act not constitute a substantial change?
It was a very significant piece of legislation, yes, and it has its own accounting officer assessments and so on.
So do you think that there's going to be a further reiteration of this assessment to take all these things into consideration?
Yeah, I mean, as I said to the chair, I keep this under constant review, and as the Treasury Officer at Accounts has said, that I receive informal advice very frequently to update different parts of the accounting officer advice, and I commit to let this committee know, first of all, when there is a summary of anything in the major projects portfolio, and when there is any significant change of assessment, and I have stuck to that commitment, and I have recommitted to that today.
Okay. So when are we going to see something that's more relevant to the timings that we've got in front of us and the changes since then than what we've seen?
Well, whenever there are changes.
But there's been significant changes. So when will we see that updated in the assessment that you provide to us?
Well, when something changes. So
things have changed. Sorry.
But I've updated you. I mean, I will carry on updating you.
Okay. I think we need to probably take some of this offline and work with our colleagues at the National Audit Office to have a good look through what is coming through in accounting officer advice. But can I say that 9 months is a very long delay for something so significant that had gone through your Finance and Investment Committee. So it had gone through Finance and Investment, 6 months later it's agreed, and then it's 9 months before Parliament sees this. And so Matthew, you will recall we had a joint session only a few weeks ago, or months ago, because we weren't getting information in real time. We seem to be going around the same loop again. It's very unfortunate.
Well, first of all, I hope that we have resolved the issues that we were discussing previously. I can commit to ensure that there is the free flow of information. On some issues, it is right and proper that the Home Secretary is the decision maker rather than myself as accounting officer. That relates certainly to anything in relation to the ministerial direction on value for money on the Rwanda scheme, but it also relates to other significant parts of the government's response to the illegal migration challenge.
I think we could end up having an interesting and lengthy debate about the constitutional position here, but a ministerial letter of direction doesn't give carte blanche for the minister then to override the accounting officer's view of what should be reported to Parliament. You have a direct accountability to this committee and to Parliament through this committee.
Absolutely, and I take that responsibility extremely seriously. But I'm just saying that the effect of the ministerial direction is that it is in this instance it is the Home Secretary who is accountable for the value for money, not the accounting officer. That is what a ministerial direction means in effect.
The programme. Well, yes, but as the programme change, well, okay. I think we may need to take this offline to have a further discussion. Just Sophie, did you want to come? No, I don't. Dame Diana?
Yeah. Do you think?
Okay, just Dame Diana.
Well, I just wanted to be clear around the Safety of Rwanda bill. There is advice that's been given, but it's not been made available. And when is that likely to be made available?
I'll have to get back to you. I think as the bill receives royal assent, but I will get back to you.
And is that the same with the Illegal Migration Act?
Well, that has received royal assent already.
That hasn't been published or made available to the Public Accounts Committee?
I thought a summary of it had, but if I'm wrong on that, I'll get back to you, or one of my colleagues will update us.
Okay.
We published the impact assessment, and we will get back to you on the timing of publishing the summary of the full accounting officer advice.
Okay. And I'd just say as well that when this was sent to us, it was already in, I think it was sent to us in recess, the 27th of March. We'd already broken up. It's really suboptimal. And I'll just say again about your parliamentary team, and maybe they're in the back listening, but they need to be a bit sharper on understanding parliamentary deadlines, because this meant we've only been able to raise it now, and it's, you know, it puts Parliament and the taxpayer on the back foot, which isn't, I'm sure, what you intend. So can we just make sure we sharpen up on that, please? Thank you. Now I wanted to move on to the issue of where the money is coming from for some of the asylum support, over to the Deputy Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, Sir Geoffrey Clifton.
Good afternoon, Sir Matthew.
Good afternoon.
You'll be aware that the BBC 4 days ago reported that 4.3 billion of the foreign aid budget went on supporting refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. I think a lot of the British public would be surprised to find that what they thought they were spending on important work in developing countries was instead being spent in this country on dealing with refugees and asylum seekers. Is that sustainable?
It's absolutely not sustainable, and that is why the government is taking such novel and decisive and robust action to stop the boats and more broadly to deter illegal migration. It is a statutory obligation on the government, as you know, Sir Geoffrey, for the government to provide support, including accommodation, for asylum seekers who would otherwise be destitute. And the rules of overseas development assistance mean that the first year of those costs in any donor country, that those costs count as official development assistance. So it's not a choice of the British government to score that money as official development assistance. It's just part of the rules of what counts as ODA.
It may well be part of the rules, and it may well qualify for ODA spending. And, of course, part of the answer is to try and reduce that cost, which has gone up from 16% since 2022. But it is a quarter of all our aid spending. So it is a very big part of that spending. And just because it's allowable under the rules, is that a correct way of allocating these costs? Should it not come under the Home Office budget?
So what I meant by my previous answer, Geoffrey, but just to elucidate, there's no choice. It's not a government policy decision whether or not to count this spending as ODA. It is ODA. It has to count as ODA because the rules describe what sorts of activity counts as official development assistance, and then a donor like the UK abides by those rules and sets out annually all of its spending that meets those rules. And this spending for the first year of asylum seekers does meet those rules, and that is why there is no choice about it but to score it as ODA. So there is, of course, also a very significant amount of activity to reduce those costs. It is much too high. That is why we, as I'm sure we'll talk about, we are seeking to reduce our reliance on hotels, which is a very large proportion of those costs, to bear down on that money, not least so that the official development assistance part of taxpayers' money can be spent elsewhere.
Well, we should be examining a lot of where that money is spent. Can I move on to a different subject? You'll be aware that the Times today has reported that you are actively in talks with 4 other countries other than Rwanda for third-party removal of asylum seekers. They are Armenia, the Times reports they are Armenia, Ivory Coast, Costa Rica and Botswana. They also report that 16 other countries have been approached. Can you tell us what stage your discussions have got with those 4 countries that seem to be in the front line?
The first thing to say is that, of course, the government doesn't comment on leaks. But secondly, that is an out-of-date document. So I don't think the committee should assume that there are active negotiations with those 4 countries or that everything else in that document is currently accurate.
Right. If it's an out-of-date document, can you update us, please?
I think it's important that the substance of any negotiations with any countries other than Rwanda is kept private, but I'm happy to pursue the possibility of briefing a number of you behind the scenes, if that would be helpful.
Well, I mean, maybe we could discuss this in committee room terms in private, perhaps, because I think it is important that we in this committee, maybe the Home Affairs Committee jointly with us, are as updated on these matters as we possibly could be, because presumably there may well be good reasons why you wouldn't want to send them all to Rwanda. Maybe you want to split the load, for example.
Well, it's government policy to explore the possibility of partnerships like the one with Rwanda with other countries. And it is the job of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to scope out which countries might be available for that sort of partnership, and then to hand over to the Home Office at a due point to have the negotiation as we successfully did in relation to Rwanda. But I think committee room terms would be the way to take forward of any further discussion about the specifics of any countries.
I think that's a really helpful answer, because I appreciate the commercial and confidentiality of these discussions, but it is important that I think our two committees are updated as soon as possible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr Matt Warman, MP.
Thank you. Just to push a bit further on that, when you're thinking about which countries you might explore, which, as you say, is very much government policy, what are the criteria you're using to work out who to approach first?
As I said, the Home Office leaves the initial triage of countries quite rightly to the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and they look at a range of things, including the human rights situation in the country, the UK's relationship with the country, the size and capacity of the country, and so on.
Can you give us a sense of how many countries have been assessed and how many have got through to a further round, for instance?
Well, I think on the basis of what you will have read, I think the committee will be disappointed by the numbers that have got through the triaging process. If you're looking for, I think the numbers in the report would suggest
that you can
there
ascribe feelings to the committee on whether our views on. We're not here to discuss our views on the policy.
I think what I meant was that there are a lot that have been assessed, and a tiny number that are into the next stages of work.
And could you give us a sense of how many, as the Times reports, have rejected our overtures?
No, I don't think I could do that in public.
Any?
Well, so it's a number we're talking about. We're not asking for names. A number. Apparently, the list is too long for the Times to print.
I think it would be right for a discussion on committee room terms, but I think broadly I would say that when the Foreign Office approaches different countries, some of them reject the suggestion outright, others are interested, and the conversation continues.
We can take from that some countries have rejected it.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Dame Diana?
Just in terms of the Rwanda scheme, it's 2 years now since it was first announced, and obviously nobody has yet been sent to Rwanda. So in terms of Plan B and the Home Office looking actively at other countries, we'd be looking at a similar lead-in time, I assume, to set something up for another country, wouldn't we?
Well, first of all, Chair, the Home Office and the government as a whole is busy pursuing Plan A, which is the Safety of Rwanda bill going through Parliament, the treaty between the UK and Rwanda, and then operationalising that. At the same time, of course, we do plan for all sorts of different scenarios, which is why the work is ongoing in relation to other countries as well. And there are, of course, other parts of the strategy to reduce illegal, irregular and dangerous crossings, including all of the work that we do upstream.
In terms of B, Sir Matthew, in terms of other countries, because we know the numbers that we're looking at in terms of removals to Rwanda are fairly small at the moment. I know it's uncapped in the long term, but in the short term it's uncapped. It's very limited, a few hundred perhaps. So if you're looking at I think sharing the load was being described, looking at other countries for Plan B, we'd be still looking at probably a year, 2 years.
I think you're right to say, Chair, that there is a long lead time in terms of negotiation and preparation. But there are also, of course, benefits of having a system up and running in terms of deterrence. And the government's agreement with Albania, for instance, has demonstrated in terms of Albanian nationals.
Matthew, you know as well as I do that Albania is a very different kettle of fish to the Rwanda scheme and the deterrence that Rwanda is being put forward to meet. So that's not correct to say that.
Well, I think the reason I mentioned it in that context is that the Albania agreement demonstrates the power of the deterrent effect, and the reason that the Rwanda scheme is, if you like, Plan A, is that then that is applicable to nationals from a whole range of countries, not just Albanians. And so that is why so much effort has gone into the Safety of Rwanda Bill, the treaty between the UK and Rwanda, and the preparations to operationalise the partnership with flights as soon as possible after royal assent and ratification of the treaty.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So as far as it goes, that brings us to the Rwanda partnership very neatly. You've just then said exactly what I was going to ask about, actually. So if there's obviously legislation going through the House this week, if it does pass, how quickly will you be able to, what are your plans to get people relocated to Rwanda, and how many?
We have robust plans to operationalise the partnership. We aren't going to go into detail today in terms of any...
it's such a jargon. Operationalisation of the partnership doesn't tell us very much at all. What do you mean by that?
Operationalising the partnership means getting flights to Rwanda. The government policy is to get flights to Rwanda as soon as possible after royal assent and ratification of the treaty, and the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister will set out what that means in detail after royal assent and ratification.
Okay, and you're expecting, if a bill goes through, expecting royal assent pretty quickly. Under Her Majesty, it was always very rapid. Are you expecting it to be potentially this week or next week?
Yes. For royal assent, yes.
Well, but what we'll do is we'll go through some of the other questions about that in a moment. We just wanted to pin down costs, because the National Audit Office's fieldwork finished in January. The figures are up to date. Sorry, in February. The figures are up to date to January. What are the costs to date of the Rwanda partnership?
So as the National Audit Office set out, and indeed as I've set out to this committee, the first year cost, so in 22-23 financial year, the total cost was 120 million, plus 20 million, if you like, in the bank, from which Rwanda can draw down. In the second year, 23-24, it was 100 million, and then 24-25, the financial year that is just starting, the UK government is due to pay the government of Rwanda 50 million.
So you haven't paid, it hasn't gone out this month.
That's
yet,
right.
But it is going out imminently?
It will go out, as soon as we have royal assent and ratification of the treaty.
So that is dependent on royal assent. So if royal assent is not given, then that money does not go to Rwanda.
Well, we are due to pay that money, and we're planning to do so.
That's what I thought. So you're due to pay that money regardless of whether the bill becomes an act.
I mean, as we've discussed previously, there are break clauses in the memorandum of understanding, and I wouldn't want to sort of preclude, even hypothetically, any future action. But the plan absolutely is to spend the money that is planned
just to be clear,
imminently.
I don't like dealing in hypotheticals, but just so we're just clear about the money. This money we know already, because thanks to the National Audit Office, is earmarked to go out this financial year, usually, and previous ones have gone out about this time. Yes. But you're not actually sent it yet because you're waiting for the Act to be get royal assent.
But I think we're not talking about a very long delay.
Okay, so it's sort of slightly hedging just in case, or as you might put it, because I imagine you are. Well, I wouldn't want to imagine what you're imagining, but there we go. I think Mr. Lawton wanted to come in on this point.
Costs.
Can I just go to Olivia Blake? Did you first, and then I'll come.
I was going to ask a question on numbers again. But how many people will be impacted by the duty to remove under the Illegal Migration Act? Like how many? What's the latest estimate on that number?
Who shall I turn to for that?
Mr. Hobbs?
It's me. Obviously, the duty to remove applies to anyone who arrives from a safe third country illegally in the UK. The impact assessment as published, so broadly it is anyone who is arriving by small boats or otherwise from a safe third country. I don't have the precise modelling number in front of us, but since the 7th of March, we've the numbers are around 30,000 so far that fall under the purview of the Illegal Migration Act, although that has not yet been commenced, as the committee will be aware.
And is there an estimate for a kind of an annual number at all?
So in the economic impact assessment, we set out the modelling for the Illegal Migration Act. I don't have the number immediately to hand, but as I say, it applies to anyone who's arriving irregularly or illegally into the UK from a safe third country.
We get that number, is that possible?
Yeah, we can have the figure. We would like to see the figures, please. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Blake. Mr. Lawton.
Okay, so this is quite an important number, isn't it? And it's a growing number. It can only really be a growing number. So since the terms of the Illegal Migration Act came in, anybody who has arrived in a boat or from another safe third country, the government has a duty to remove them without assessing asylum claims, with a few exceptions, I think, as you've demonstrated before, Mr. Hobbs. That's right.
Correct, although the duty has not been commenced. So the duty doesn't apply. It's set out in the legislation, but that piece of the legislation has yet to be commenced.
So you don't have a duty for anybody still arriving on a boat now to
They are
remove
inadmissible
them?
under the Nationality and Borders Act. The duty to remove measure has not yet been commenced under the Illegal Migration Act.
So that figure of 30,000 or whatever, the now 6,200 number who've come across Canada, 24 across the channel approximately, including over 500, I think, over the weekend, we do not have a duty to remove them as it stands, and they could apply for asylum.
The duty to remove is not in place, but they are inadmissible under the terms of the Nationality and Borders Act. So they're already inadmissible to the UK asylum system and therefore are pending relocation. So their asylum claim is not admitted unless they fall under one of the exemptions.
Right.
The duty on the Secretary of State to remove them has yet to commence.
And that figure is likely to be in excess of 30,000, we think, roughly, but you haven't got the exact
broadly
number.
since the 7th of March.
Mr. Ridley, you've got the exact number.
So the number that was last published is 33,000, just over. We will publish the next statistics in May.
How old was that 33,000?
End of 31st of December was when we published it.
Right, so it was 33,000 for
After the 28th of December.
Okay, end of 23, to which we can add at least 6,200 who we know have come across in boats. So we are talking about a figure probably in excess now of 40,000.
We'll publish in our next
So
statistics.
just to be clear,
in
is
May.
it quarterly figures published just after the quarter?
Yeah, so we publish them in our Home Office stats every quarter.
Okay, but it's not beyond the bounds of rationality that we are looking at a figure of 40,000 plus, and as it stands, they can't apply for asylum. The Home Secretary is not yet obliged to remove them, so they are entirely in limbo.
Correct, they are pending relocation at this time.
Which is limbo, effectively, isn't it?
Well, they're inadmissible under the
Status in the-
Nationality and Borders Act, and they
Have no status in the UK, and the Home Secretary is not yet obliged to remove them, so they are in limbo. I think most people would describe them. What's going to happen to them? Because if we've now got 40,000 who are looking to remove, of which a great number may be to countries who do not accept them, otherwise they might have been removed under other criteria already, then that's a lot of additional seats on planes to Rwanda when they start, isn't it? Or is something else going to affect their status?
So under the terms of the Illegal Migration Act, it goes to the arrivals after the 7th of March last year. The inadmissibility once commenced and the duty will apply to them. So they will fall under the current terms of the Act to be relocated to Rwanda.
All of them?
Under the current legislation, that is the proposal. Rwanda or another safe third country as provided for in the legislation.
I think the more concise answer to my question was yes. So we've got 40,000 people in limbo. What will happen to them when the duty of the Home Secretary is effective? How will we remove them if they are to countries that will not receive them, of which we know a large number will be, and we've had discussions about those countries before? Or are you anticipating that those 40,000 and growing will be on flights to Rwanda at some stage?
So under the terms of the Act and the existing legislation, they're inadmissible to our system, so will fall for relocation to a safe third country, including Rwanda, which is our
You've
current.
said that with respect, Mr. Hobbs, several times. So what's going to happen to them?
So they will be treated under the legislation once it's commenced.
And what's going to happen to them practically?
So,
40,000 people, practically, where are they going to go?
So whilst they're in the UK, if they were otherwise destitute, they are provided with accommodation and support. Once commenced, they will then be part of the workflow to go through the provisions set out in the Illegal Migration Act that allows them to bring claims on whether it would be imminent, serious, irreversible harm if they were transferred to Rwanda, and then they go through that process.
With respect, we understand the process. What we don't understand is the solution. And Permanent Secretary, is it therefore possible, if not probable, that all or a large part of that 40,000 may be subject to some form of amnesty because practically you just can't remove them?
Well, the government is not planning to do that, Mr. Lawton. The government is planning to operationalise the safety of Rwanda bill as soon as there is royal assent, which is imminent, probably. So the Prime Minister and Home Secretary will be setting out essentially the answer to your question, which is, what are the steps that are required in order to get the first flights off to Rwanda. The cohorts on those flights will be from that group of people.
Right, but it's 40,000. And the Home Office is not anticipating anything like 40,000 in the near future.
Yeah.
They are going to remain in limbo, aren't they, unless you grant an amnesty?
Well, the Prime Minister and Home Secretary will set that out in very soon.
So the Home Office never wants to talk about an amnesty, but I do recall when I was first elected in 2005, there was something that was an amnesty, effectively, for similar reasons. But I can see that Sir Matthew wouldn't want to say that here in the room today. I just want to go back briefly to Ms Blake and then to Jonathan Ginogly MP.
Just another numbers question, really. When will the government expect to process the 22,268 claims that were made between the 7th of March and 19th of July in 2023? So that's another group in limbo.
Ms Rowland?
We're working through those cases now.
Ms Rowland?
Yeah, so all of our asylum cases are worked in cohort order. Our decision makers are currently finalising all of the claims that were received under the Nationality and Borders Act as far as they are workable. And as soon as that is complete, we'll be starting to work on any that were received on the 7th of March. Obviously, the degree to which that processes to a decision won't be for some months, because the process of working any claim is a multi-month process. There's substantial checks that need to be made. There are obviously interviews that are undertaken before the evidence is put to a decision maker.
Ballpark figure for when you expect to get to the bottom of that pile?
I would think we would start working on them next month.
That's at the beginning of that cohort?
That's the beginning of the processing, yes.
So then you'll be working through in order?
We work in order, yes.
When do you think you'll have completed those on your current trajectory of caseworker decision-making timetables?
So I wouldn't want to give an exact timescale.
No, a range would be fine, but just when within month, which 6-month period do you think?
So as you know, and we'll probably cover this later, we've increased our productivity of decision-making to about 6 decisions a week per decision-maker. But that was on previous rules. These are new rules for our decision makers. It's going to take a short while for us to understand what a reasonable productivity expectation is of them, and then I'll be able to give a timescale.
Okay, well, we'll come back to some of that in a moment. Ms Blake?
No, that's everything, really.
Mr Ginogly, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Well, having somewhat painfully gone round the numbers on the duty to remove, could I just now have a look, please, at the numbers of people who are going to be able to be accommodated in Rwanda? There's been a varying numbers put about. The weekend press had all sorts of numbers, and before I join the speculation, could I perhaps, Matthew, ask you for some numbers?
I mean, of course, the Home Office has done a lot of modelling in answer to that question. But there are so many variables, and as you know, and as we keep repeating, the scheme is uncapped. But as the NEO report sets out, some of the funding of the agreement between the UK and Rwanda was designed to incentivise the Rwandans to be able to accept both a quick first series of flights and with separate funding to incentivise significant volumes in due course. So it's up to our Rwandan partners to provide and find the accommodation for those people. So we're not going to speculate about numbers.
Well, on day one, surely you can say what the numbers are going to be.
Well, what we're going to do is to ramp up. We're not going to set out, how fast we want the ramp up to go, but we are working actively with our Rwandan partners about that.
I mean, I've seen 300, I've seen 500. What are we talking about?
There are a lot of different numbers out there, and I think there are too many variables to add to that mix.
So my surprise here is that you've been discussing this with the Rwandans for a long time now. This is not something new.
Yep.
and you have pretty much bottomed out what you're going to be paying them. You know where they're going to be going. You've seen the facilities. You know what the facilities are. You must have some model of, ballpark figures as to what the numbers that they can take could be by when.
We have modelled that. We have worked closely with them on that. And one of the many things that we've learned over the last 2 years since the partnership started is not to speculate about things like that, given the number of variables. So we have plans to operationalise the partnership as soon as we have royal assent of the Safety of Rwanda Bill and the treaty is ratified, and we will take it from there.
I mean, I can see that you would have an issue if you were talking about further accommodation. But there's accommodation there. The Home Secretary, or the previous Home Secretary, went and walked around it. I mean, you must be able to give us a figure as to numbers that they can take.
It's the responsibility of our Rwandan partners to provide that accommodation, and they have assured us, and we have tested that over the month, indeed over the last 2 years, that they have that capability to accommodate the people who we will be relocating.
So am I right in saying that you've just said that if you provide, however many you provide, they will provide the numbers for them?
That's right. The scheme is uncapped of the many variables, of the many constraints. One of the things is the capacity and capability at the Rwandan end, which is one of the reasons why the UK has invested in the partnership to build up that capability. And so we know that they have the capability to organise, to provide and to organise enough accommodation for those who will be being relocated there.
So as far as you're concerned, the issue is the question of how many people we can transport there, rather than the accommodation being there when they arrive.
Well, there are all sorts of constraints, and there are all sorts of factors that we need to take into account, but we have been spending the time between the publication of the partnership and today in preparing for all sorts of different eventualities. So we have plans, we have options, and we have contingency options.
Okay, so last question, Chair. As far as you're concerned, they are prepared and willing and ready to take as many people as we transport there?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dame Diana.
Could I just return to the 40,000 that could be removed to Rwanda? First of all, are they, once the part of the Illegal Migration Act is enacted, which allows them to be detained, would the funding from ODA then not be applicable? Is that correct? Or is it correct as soon as it's enacted, the 40,000 are not eligible to be supported through ODA funding?
So it's a matter partly as part of the accounting officer advice that is kept under review about going back to the very first answer about whether it is classified as ODA if they are treated under the Illegal Migration Act. So it's something that is currently being reviewed as part of the overall accounting officer advice.
And that's because they are subject to detention?
It's not a case of detention that's the issue. The duty to remove is a bit. It's very similar to the duty to remove under foreign national offenders. That doesn't necessarily trigger the ability to detain. Our ability to detain, we can detain now where there's a reasonable prospect of removal. So it's not that change. It is the classification of the individuals that can change the ODA rules.
Sorry, just say that again. The classification.
It's the classification, as the Permanent Secretary was talking about earlier, in terms of if someone is classified as an asylum seeker in a country's asylum system for the first year, that is classified as ODA. It's the change in nature of how those people are treated, not necessarily the detention.
Because they're in limbo, because they can't claim asylum.
It's because of in relation to the inadmissibility, and that's the issue that's being under review by our finance colleagues in relation with the Treasury on the ODA rules and applicability in that sense.
And presumably you're talking to the National Audit Office about this?
The finance teams in the Home Office are exploring the issue.
And the second question I wanted to ask was around when they become eligible to be removed, if this is enacted, which I think we're all assuming it will be. What's the actual plan? Are you going to detain 40,000 people on the basis that they will then be removed to Rwanda? What's going to happen?
So, as the Permanent Secretary said, there are both plans to operationalise the UK-Rwanda agreement under the existing legislation, and then for when the Illegal Migration Act is enacted in full, the duty commenced, because the IMA, the Illegal Migration Act, isn't the only bit of legislation that enables the removal. It can be done under existing legislation. The operational plans are advancing on that. As you know, that the detention capacity is a limiting factor. Work is going on to expand that detention capacity and work through it, but there are plans and operations to both deal with that that are being worked through.
You've said a lot of words there and not actually answered my question. So 40,000 people potentially to be removed. I think the capacity for detention is about 2,500.
Approximately, yeah. There are plans to expand the detention
By
capacity.
how many?
I think it's a further 1,000 that are coming online, with 2 further sites that are being brought online, Campsfield and Haslar.
But where, sorry?
Campsfield and Haslar.
Haslar and Gosford.
Right. And so that assumes that you're going to have waves of people being detained. Is that what you're planning in this operational?
There are a variety of operational plans that depend on flow. It's probably not appropriate to go through full operational planning, but as you suggest, the plans will look at both the existing population and what flow happens in terms of the decision to detain. Some people won't be appropriate for detention for obvious reasons, but those plans are underway within the department.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah.
Okay. Tim Lawton, MP.
I'm dealing with costs now, I'm sorry.
Yes.
You have a very different system of appeals to us. Can we look at the actual flight costs and nature of the flights? Because there's been a degree of opaqueness about what aircraft may be available or not. In the partnership report, the Home Office estimates a cost of £11,000 per relocated individual for flights. That's some in-flight entertainment going on there. What actually does it include?
So this is based on an internal estimate which we share with the National Audit Office, as is our statutory obligation, in order to give a sense of the sort of aspects of operationalisation that would need to take place. There are, as I've said in another context, so many variables. I wouldn't want the committee to say that it'll definitely be £11,000 per person for putting on the flight. It'll depend on lots of different things, including which sort of aircraft and so on.
Okay, but won't it also depend quite a lot on escorts?
It will, but there's a separate, and of course, as the National Audit Office report sets out, there's a separate cost for escorting and training of escorts and so on.
Well, there's a separate cost for training of escorts, estimated at £12.6 million for 2024-25, and then £1 million per year in future. Where's the actual cost of the escorts included? Is it included in that 11,000, or is there an additional cost on top of the 11,000 per individual and the 12.6 training budget?
I think the cost for the actual escorting of the flights is included in the 11,000.
Okay. Is that right?
Do you think that's right? So we're just looking.
Well,
2.2. Oliver Lodge from the National Audit Office can.
As far as I understand, it isn't included in the 11,000, but we didn't break out that cost explicitly in the report because it depends on the number of flights that are put on.
Number of people.
So we didn't include it because to do so we would have had to make an assumption about how many people would have been transported and when. So it's an additional cost.
So this is why this is a very variable figure, because we don't know. It's been suggested that there are going to be small numbers per flight, but more flights, rather than trying to fill up a complete plane with lots of people where you have the economies of scale. But different types of individuals require a different level of escort. Some may be none, some may be even 3. Depending on the risk factor that they're attached. So that 11,000 per individual is completely spurious, isn't it?
I mean, sorry, I might add, but it's a proxy. It's an estimate, and it absolutely will vary person by person. Yeah.
Mr. Ridley, did you want to add something?
Well, I mean, just to agree with with Sir Matthew, there are a number of variables here, as you have just pointed out, Mr. Lawton. It is an estimate. You are right that the number of escorts per person will vary according to the risk assessment of the individual. So the overall cost of a given flight, taking in all of that, will vary considerably.
Okay, so let's look at the training costs. You already retain a firm to do the escorting duties for existing people who are being deported, don't you?
Yes.
Which is?
Mighty.
And you'll be using Mighty to do this in the future, or is this a completely separate contract?
We are working with them to expand the number of escorts that we have got, but I don't want to.
Okay, so the escorts that you already use through Mighty are already trained. So why is there an additional 12.6 million required for training escorts for a firm where you are already contracted for them to supply trained escorts?
So, the main reason is that we're scaling up our removal operations in order to be able to run regular flights to Rwanda under the new scheme.
Why is the Home Office paying for the training? Surely you pay for Mighty to provide trained escorts. These escorts are going to be no different to the ones that are providing an existing operation, are they not?
We work very closely with our contractors to make sure that we have got the capabilities that we need to run the scheme. Those are a set of commercial discussions and negotiations, and the cost to the Home Office for training under the Rwanda scheme is the 12.6 million that is laid out in the report, and those are the commercial arrangements that we have come to make sure not only that we've got the right number of people, but they are trained appropriately for what is a novel scheme that will come under a lot of scrutiny.
Mr. Ridley, I understand all that. The question is why? Presumably the contract at the moment with Mighty is to provide X number of escorts who are already trained to suitable standard, and that will require some enhanced training for where you're dealing with violent criminals who are being returned at the moment, who are unlikely to be the sort of people who are being returned because of their asylum status. Why do we appear to be spending 12.6 million alone to train people who should already be trained by the firm that you've contracted to provide them?
The terms under which we have contracted to provide the workforce that we need, trained to the relevant skill level, is the cost that's in the is the cost that's set out in the report. We've done that to ensure that we have got, as I say, both the number and the adequately trained numbers of people to run what is a new scheme that will we do have some assumptions about behaviour change of asylum seekers who are going to Rwanda. You are right that we do already remove some violent criminals, and people are trained around that. But we're running a new scheme at a different level, and we want to make sure that we have got.
Do we pay the training costs for the existing escorts who are provided by Mighty?
I haven't got the details of our existing contract in front of me.
Okay, I think we need some more details on that, because I don't think we pay training costs for Mighty's current contract. We take on trained people, and it's up to Mighty to provide trained people, and their rate will be paid for depending on their suitability. Here we've got this additional, not inconsiderable figure of 12.6 million for training people to carry on doing the job that they're already doing under a different sort of scheme. And there's also, in the past, there have been many instances where Mighty, or whoever was doing the operation before, have failed to turn up at the requisite time to Brookhouse or somewhere else to transport those people to the plane and potentially escort them as well. So what recovery costs are there if they fail to show up to do the job?
So just say on the first point, I mean, we because of the need to scale up numbers, we have also needed to make sure that there is that there are adequate that there is the sort of scale of training facilities that we need, and we've also needed to be able to do this quickly. So there are a number of additional costs from us doing this for the Rwanda scheme at the scale and at the pace that has been required, and those are what are reflected in the costs. We can certainly come back with some more detail of that, subject to the sort of necessary commercial confidentialities. But this isn't the normal run of business that we are working with our partners.
What other contracts do we have between the Home Office and a firm providing staff, where the Home Office pays for the training?
I mean,
Any example?
Well, have a think about it and.
Could you? I mean, I'm sure that's not rocket
I mean,
science.
I don't have every.
If you could look
contract in my
into
mind,
that and
I'll
come back
have
to
a
us in
think about
writing.
it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Lawton. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Deputy Chair.
Yes, Mr. Ridley, you may be the right person to answer these, but I want to ask you just, it would be wrong to have this part of the session without fully understanding the total costs of this partnership. And I'd just like to be absolutely sure that we've understood it. And so I could take you to paragraph 2.1 on page 12 and just run through the costs. I think what those paragraphs are telling us is that the ETIF payment, that's the Economic Transformation and Integration Fund payment, over 5 years is 370 million. It's also telling us that if 300 people are relocated over 5 years, which is not unreasonable, 60 people a year doesn't seem to be an overly ambitious target for all this work. So 20,000 per individual relocated would be another 6 million, and a further 120 million once 300 people have been relocated, and a further 150,000 in round figures per one of those 300, each one of those 300, which is another 45 million. According to my maths, at those figures, the total paid to the Rwandan government would be 541 million. Is that correct over 5 years, if 300 people are relocated?
So that is a correct summary of what the NAO has laid out in the report, but it is important to say that, as both Sir Matthew and Dan Hobbs have said, this is an uncapped scheme, so this is about paying money up front for a scheme that would go far beyond 300
Understood,
people.
it's an uncapped scheme, and it might well be more and it might well be less, but at those numbers, which is all it's reasonable to suppose, that's what the cost would be.
Yes, the report has correctly laid out both the ETIF points and the
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. So how did you assess and review the Rwandan government's estimate of processing and integration costs? Mr. Ridley.
Well, I might hand over to Dan, who had most of the discussions with the Rwandans.
So, thank you, Mr. Ridley. So, in terms of the direct costs, setting aside the Economic and Transformation Partnership, it was a negotiation that we worked through with them on the breakdown of the various elements of the package that they were supporting. So, in terms of the accommodation costs, the integration, education, and facilities that they would provide, and we worked through the cost of those elements. It was never intended that this would be sought to be done at significantly lower cost than the UK. This was about having a quality scheme that delivered for the individuals and gave a 5-year package of support. It was agreed that it would diminish over the period, so the annual payments reduce over the period, because you would expect people to become more self-sufficient, and there is higher costs at the beginning in terms of the processing of the individuals and their assimilation and integration into Rwanda, and that over the period of the 5 years you would expect them to become more self-sufficient. So that's how the agreement was structured. One was on the evidence they provided in terms of the costs that they would incur in supporting the individuals, and that it would tail off over the period as people became more sufficient.
I think you said at the beginning of that answer that these costs were equalised with those of the UK. So these are not Rwandan costs.
Not equalised, no. So we were not seeking to do it at a lower cost. So there was never an intention of seeking to make this a purely cost-driven agreement in terms of the comparative between the UK and Rwanda. It was based on the evidence of what Rwanda provided to us on what the direct costs would be to them of providing the services.
So could we assume then that if all these people were processed in the UK as opposed to being sent to Rwanda, the costs would be the same?
The illegal migration economic impact assessment sets out the counterfactual of costs related to the asylum system and the do-nothing option as a comparator, and that was published. That foresaw that the accommodation bill, I think, would inflate to something like £11 billion a year, and the comparative a proxy cost was 160,000 over the 5 years, was what was set out in the economic impact assessment.
Okay. And how will this change once you've met your other policy objectives, such as getting out of hotels? This cost that you're incurring at the moment that we've referred to at the beginning, the 4.3 billion.
So in terms of the UK costs, I mean, a big part of providing support to otherwise who would be destitute is the accommodation costs. As I say, there's a figure in the paper, in the economic impact assessment on that per night, which does in part relate to hotels, but obviously partly the intention of the policy is deterring individuals coming from safe countries, incentivising people to claim in the first safe country or where they have found sanctuary. There would be other costs that we would not incur should the deterrence effect impact, including our operations in terms of border force and Manston and other elements. So it's quite a complex figure to get to if the deterrent, but I think the economic impact assessment set out the various levels of cost in the public document.
We'll be coming back to more of that in the next session, next part of this hearing. So Matthew, how do your current relocation plans affect your assessment of the feasibility of the partnership?
I continue to assess that the partnership is feasible. There are risks in relation to feasibility, but there's also a huge amount of work by Home Office staff under Simon's direction to get the partnership up and running.
So at what point will you have the evidence to conclude whether this policy represents value for money, which is why you've got an accounting officer exemption in the first place?
The ministerial direction.
Ministerial direction in the first place.
I keep that assessment under constant review. Once the flights to Rwanda are up and running, and once there have been some of them, it should be possible to see whether there is a deterrent effect. There are analysts working on this issue in the Home Office, and they will be updating me each quarter or more frequently if there is some significant change.
So I just want to probe you a little more on that, because that is critical, really. It was critical to the whole success of the whole partnership, really, this deterrent effect. How many people need to be deterred, in your view, for you to make that assessment that it is value for money?
First of all, I agree absolutely that it is essential for the judgment about whether it is value for money or not to judge what sort of deterrent effect has the policy had. Secondly, the initial modelling, which we did make public, suggested that in the previous year there needed to be a roughly 1/3 reduction. This is from 2022 levels for the policy to count as value for money. Of course, it is difficult to assess what part this policy plays in terms of any reduction compared with other policies that the government is pursuing, such as the Albania agreement that I referenced earlier and other things that the government is doing. But that is the analysis job that needs to be done.
We just, finally, Chair, if I may, just in this section. I haven't got the figures for 22, but no doubt you've got them on the top of your mind. Is it round about 35,000? Is that the sort of figure that we're talking about?
That's right. And as it happens, there was about a 1/3 reduction between 2022 and 2023 because of Albania and other things. And so, of course, the government will be looking for a further reduction on top of that, and that is why we're working so hard.
But the 23 figures, I think, were 45,000, weren't they? I can't remember what the 20
were. They were the other way round.
Yeah.
Yes. So we could, given that you think that you need a third to make that assessment, you're going to need a reduction of about 10,000.
Approximately. But I will come back to the committee once that work has done, and certainly I'll be looking at it every quarter, and more often than that if there is a significant change. I have discussed with this committee and the Home Affairs Select Committee in the past that assessment, and I think there were some questions about whether it was possible to expect some sort of deterrent effect before flights were up and running. I think it's now fair to say that that is not likely, but once flights are up and running, then it should be possible to make that assessment.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Okay, but of course, if you reduce the costs of asylum management in the UK, which we'll be covering some of in our next bit of the session, then actually you'll have to see a different figure, won't you?
That is absolutely right. So the comparator is the per person per night costs, accommodation plus all of the other costs that we need to take account of. The do nothing option, as Dan put it, and that number is also changing. So that's one of the challenges.
Before I move on to Mr. Grant, I mean, I've actually visited Rwanda and I visited a UNHCR camp with a lot of, in that case, mostly Congolese refugees there, and saw the conditions that they were living in, free potentially to go able and get work and so on. They were free to travel, but lots lots of challenges in that situation. Have you at all considered that the offer that is now being made to people who arrive on boats to the UK to go to Rwanda is actually an incentive to people to seek to relocate to Rwanda via the UK rather than through other routes? That actually it could be driving people to get a £120,000 package to settle somewhere rather than being stuck in a UN camp for, well, in fact, in case I saw generations of children who'd grown up in that camp.
No, I don't think there is yet evidence to suggest that that is a driver of behaviour. As you know, Chair, the government's assessment, ministers strongly believe this, that the deterrent effect is likely to outweigh any other type of behaviour.
Okay, just
deterring people from leaving one safe country, in the case of small boat arrivals, France, to come to the UK. That is the journey that the government is seeking to deter through the Rwanda partnership.
Well, except that the French aren't offering £120,000 relocation packages, but I'll leave that as more perhaps about the policy. I'm going to now turn to Mr. Peter Grant, MP. Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. So, Matthew, staying on the deterrence just for a minute. So what we're saying is that the government's view is that the likelihood of drowning in the Channel doesn't deter people. The likelihood of detention without trial, effectively without limit of time on something like the Baby Stockholm, doesn't deter people. But the likelihood of being given lots of money to start a new life is going to deter people. That is the government's interpretation of what will deter and what won't. Am I correct?
The government's policy is to deter people from making unnecessary and dangerous journeys, and that is why we're working with our colleagues and partners in France to reduce the numbers of crossings. We also work further upstream with countries where most or many of these asylum seekers come from to seek to create the conditions that mean that they do not need to leave their home countries in the first place. And as Dan said earlier, if they do, that they should be seeking asylum in the first safe country that they come to. There are, of course, lots of other factors at play, but the overall purpose of the Rwanda policy is to deter people from coming to the UK if they do not have the right to be here.
Now, a minute ago you said the intention was to stop dangerous illegal crossings. Now you said the intention is to stop people from coming.
They do not have the right to be here. Not least as one of the ways to get here is very dangerous.
You haven't assessed the costs and benefits of the Rwanda scheme against the costs and benefits of actually providing a safe and legal means for people to come here and apply for application for asylum in the correct way. You haven't done that assessment, have you?
Well, as you know, Mr. Grant, there are safe and legal routes for some people already, and the government is committed to assessing whether there is a possibility to create further safe and legal routes in the future.
Thank you. I want to now look at the measures that you're taking to make sure that this scheme doesn't get abused, because potentially there's a lot of money going to be floating around there. How confident are you that the necessary safeguards are in place to make sure that taxpayers' money isn't frittered away through fraud or other abuse of the scheme?
We have a shared interest with our Rwandan colleagues in ensuring the success of the scheme and the appropriate spending of all of the money. And so we have set up both a joint committee and a monitoring committee to help ensure that all UK money is spent in Rwanda in the way for which it was intended.
What lessons have you learned from a number of your colleague departments from the massive losses through fraud and wastage that they incurred during the COVID pandemic?
I wasn't going to retire.
I'm not sure there are direct lessons to learn from spending during COVID in the UK to apply to spending outside COVID circumstances in Rwanda, other than the importance of transparency and regular monitoring. So if you like, the governance arrangements are where we have put our effort, and we have been spending the last 2 years before the operationalisation of the partnership in setting up those arrangements.
Does keeping Parliament waiting 9 months for an accounting officer assessment contribute to that transparency that you just mentioned?
I'm committed to providing this committee and the Home Affairs Select Committee with as much as possible.
Thank you. Mr Hobbs, first of all, can I come back briefly to the question of the 30,000 or so people who will fall under the scheme if and when it's enacted? Where are they just now?
So if they were otherwise destitute under our legal requirements, we will be providing them with support. That may be in the form of accommodation or subsistence or both, or they may be in the UK subject to immigration bail, not supported if they have other financial means to support themselves.
So do you actually know where they all are?
So we will have addresses and details for individuals. They are required to update the Home Office and they are generally required to report regularly, and that is part of our ongoing policy and operations around enforcement and reporting of those in the UK who are subject to immigration control.
But does that mean that you know where they are, or that you know where they say they are? Because let's face it, the Home Office historically has not had a good record at knowing where people are, whether they came here legally, illegally, or as refugees or asylum seekers.
So we will have details of residences that are provided for each of the individuals. They are required to update those, and as I said, they will be subject to regular reporting requirements, which will enable us to keep contact, and where they don't, allows us to action any absconding elements and our trace and locate services where appropriate.
Thank you. Part of the scheme sets out that there's a payment each year for 5 years to the Rwandan government while somebody is in Rwanda. Those payments stop if the person chooses to leave Rwanda. How will you know if they've left Rwanda?
Because under the agreement, Rwandans are required to provide full detailed information to us on a regular basis. They are in the process of readying the implementation of tracking individuals and whether they choose to stay and being able to report on their ongoing residence in Rwanda. Obviously, Rwanda are required to provide their accommodation, so they will know whether there are ongoing accommodation and other costs associated with that individual. But there is a reporting requirement on the Rwandans as part of the financial measures under the treaty.
Have the Home Office independently assessed the ability of the Rwandan government to implement a tracking scheme for potentially 30 or 40,000 people?
So, through the Joint Committee and with the Independent Monitoring Committee, there are measures in place to do the reporting. The Rwandans have reporting requirements in terms of accountancy and their systems and processes, and we continue to work with them. We have Home Office staff located in Kigali in readiness for the transfer of individuals, and we continue to work with them on their operational readiness and ours in terms of preparations for go live of the policy once the bill and the treaty are ratified.
How do you make sure that someone doesn't just keep going round in circles, go and live in Rwanda, come out of Rwanda, turn up in the UK as an asylum seeker, get sent back to Rwanda again, pick up another package? How are you going to know that's not happening?
It's just important the package doesn't go to the individual. The payment is made to the government of Rwanda. So it's unclear that there would be an incentive for a person with 5 years' worth of support, because it's not a direct... The payments set out in the NAA report are not direct payments to the individual. They are payments to the Rwandan government to provide those services. But
you are going to be making sure that the Rwandan government is spending the money on providing services for those people?
So yes, so they have to provide accountability and reports to the Joint Monitoring Committee, and the Independent Monitoring Committee also have the ability to oversee that. They are done against through their Office Auditor General and in line with international accountancy standards.
How much would it have cost to provide the same services in the UK to these people?
So we don't have that immediate figure to hand. As I say, the economic impact assessment on the Illegal Migration Act looks at the immigration system costs, the direct costs in terms of the immigration system, the non-quantifiable. It does talk about the non-quantifiable costs in terms of those elements, but there is not a direct comparator figure for providing the same support.
Thank you. I know there's been questions asked previously, Sir Matthew, about the scheme, which I understand is not actually part of the Rwanda agreement. The Home Office will offer to pay failed asylum seekers in the UK if they agree to relocate to Rwanda. Has that offer been discussed with the Rwandan government? Are they comfortable with it?
It has been discussed. You're right to say, Mr. Grant, that it wasn't part of the original memorandum of understanding, but it was an additional agreement that the two governments came to relatively recently. And yes, fully discussed with our...
What's the figure? What's £6,000 to relocate back to your home country for someone who's a failed case? What about to Rwanda?
It's £3,000.
So they've got the charge of £3,000 to go to Rwanda or £6,000 to go back to their own country.
This is in relation to people who, by definition, have not accepted the offer to go back to their home country.
Yeah, okay, I just want to be clear. Thank you. Mr. Grant.
Have you done any assessment as to how many people per year you think are likely to take up that offer?
I mean, we've done some modelling, and we were very much seeing this as one of the ways of testing the broader partnership with Rwanda.
What was the outcome of your modelling?
So I don't think I've got any numbers to pass on, but we are the offer is there for people in that category, in that cohort.
If the Rwanda partnership agreement works, you don't need to do that modelling because they're not going to be here. There won't be any failed asylum seekers because they'll all be deterred from coming here.
Well, in the long run, absolutely. In the short run, there are a lot of failed asylum seekers in the UK.
How long is the long run in this context?
Well, it's a 5-year partnership.
Finally, am I right in understanding that the 30,000 or so that we think are going to be sent to Rwanda, or most of them, they will all come under the main sort of headings of the scheme? So what is it? About £150,000 payment to Rwanda over the 5 years for 30,000 people, plus £11,000 a head to get them there. That's adding up to what, £500 million?
So we're not well, we've of course done modelling on lots of different numbers, but it does if the scheme is of that sort of volume, then it'll be a very significant set of payments to the government of Rwanda. But those sort of payments actually are dwarfed by the amount that the government is currently spending on accommodation, and we're projected to spend on accommodation if we did nothing.
Yeah, that's because the running of the accommodation and the processing of asylum applications has been such a mess for decades, isn't it? It would be possible to save billions of pounds on support for asylum seekers just by doing it properly and getting the applications assessed on time instead of waiting years to do them.
As Joe was saying, in answer to a previous question, we have been working both on the productivity of each asylum caseworker, and she didn't say, but let me add that we have more than doubled the number of asylum seekers. So we are making caseworkers. So we're making significantly more decisions each week, each month than previously, as one of the many measures that the government is taking in order to tackle this set of challenges.
Thank you. And I think we might be looking at the costs of accommodation for asylum seekers in a few minutes' time in the next session, but that's all from me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. Sarah Olney MP.
Thank you, Chair. So, Matthew, the rationale for the scheme is primarily deterrence, that people will be deterred at the prospect of going to Rwanda from crossing the channel in the first place. How many people need to have been deterred in order for this scheme to represent value for money?
Well, in answer to the previous question, I said that in 2022 it was approximately one-third.
One-third of?
One-third of the 2022 numbers.
Okay.
But of course it will depend on a lot of variables. So that's one of the things which Home Office analysts are looking at right now, and which I've just committed to report back to this committee. They'll be updating me every quarter.
And how are you counting that? Well, how will you collect the data to say these people would have come, but now they're not?
I mean, it's a very good question, and it's my question to the analysts as well. But I'm leaving it to them at the moment to come up with the best possible answer to that question.
We don't currently have a mechanism for producing the kind of like the key metric that will demonstrate value for money for this programme. We don't currently have a way of measuring that, of collecting that data.
We haven't yet set out exactly what will go into the assessment about the amount of deterrence that might have happened as a result of Rwanda. That is correct.
But you're confident that we will?
Well, I that's the challenge to the analysts, and I look forward to discussing it with this committee in due course.
So you said
I don't think it'd be reasonable to have it yet because we haven't.
I don't think it's reasonable to have a metric yet for assessing the.
Once the flights are up and running, it'll be possible to make the judgment, and at that point, I will be keen to say more about the sort of factors that will be going into that assessment.
And if I may, it's not a question of a metric. Because of the complexity and the number of variables, this is ultimately about an assessment based on a number of different pieces of work that we will need to do. There's obviously the sort of monitoring of the numbers. which will show us a reduction. But the challenge is to be able to mark causality, because the Rwandan scheme is one part of the work we're doing, as we've said earlier in this hearing, to stop the boats and to reduce illegal migration. So we need to do a combination of qualitative and quantitative work, and then bring that together to be able to assess the impact of this scheme.
You're saying there's a further complexity in that once we start to see your expected reduction in crossings, you won't be necessarily able to isolate the extent to which that was the Rwanda.
So that's what the assessment is. I mean, the metric is small boats crossings at some level. We want that to go down, and the Rwanda scheme is a key part of the strategy. But then we need to assess what is it that is driving those numbers down, amongst lots of different things that we are doing, and that is about understanding the motivations of the individuals, the things that gangs are doing, and those who are providing the boats.
The individuals who haven't made the crossing.
Yes, or the motivations of the people who are still making the crossings. Unless we have succeeded in deterring it completely.
What might have deterred them?
So it's ultimately that's absolutely right. This is a complicated assessment where there are a number of actors, both in the criminals who are moving people across Europe and then into small boats, the people who are coming across and getting into small boats to travel in. We need to understand those motivations alongside the raw numbers, which we are monitoring in a number of different ways.
So on those raw numbers, my understanding, Sir Matthew, is we're not currently seeing a reduction in crossings. At what point do we expect the deterrent effect to kick in? Is it as soon as royal assent is achieved?
Well, we will be working on a whole series of things, not just Rwanda. As I said before, there was a reduction last year. A large part of that reduction we have put down to the agreement with Albania.
That won't have been the Rwanda plan.
So
you think it may have been?
So that's a sign that deterrence works, and we will certainly be looking for a similar scale of deterrence in relation to the Rwanda partnership. I think it's pure speculation to work out whether that deterrent effect will kick in at any particular moment, which is why I was suggesting waiting until there have been even not just one flight but a series of flights, and then we'll be able to make a slightly more informed judgment. Even then, there will be, as Simon was suggesting, sort of more art than science in the judgment. There are some numbers involved, but in the end it's a judgment. And the crucial judgment is for me as a accounting officer about whether there is enough deterrent effect to mean that the overall scheme is value for money.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms Olney. Paul Barker.
Thank you, Chair. So Matthew, as of February this year, the UK government had not finalised revised arrangements with the government of Rwanda to reflect the provisional treaty. So the payment schedule still may change significantly. In addition to that, we may actually take some refugees from Rwanda, and the costs are not measured there. So what associated costs have you predicted, and what assessments and modelling have actually been made?
So in relation to the first part of the question, the treaty that the two governments signed after the Supreme Court decision is related to the Safety of Rwanda bill, which is going through the House at the moment, which is why we talk about royal assent of the bill and ratification of the treaty sort of in the same breath. Those are the two things that need to happen in order for the main Rwanda partnership to be operationalised. You're right that in the original Memorandum of Understanding there was also the possibility of refugees from other countries who are currently in Rwanda to come to the UK. I don't think that we have set out the sorts of numbers that we're expecting that part of the partnership to add up to.
You don't know numbers, but it does actually state in the NAA report that the UK will resettle a proportion of Rwanda's most vulnerable refugees. What do you understand by the most vulnerable refugees?
Mr. Osborne, want to say a bit more about this?
Yes, so when we were negotiating the treaty, there was a discussion that, as you know, Rwanda hosts a large number of refugees from the wider region, particularly from Burundi and DRC, and there was an agreement that we may take a small number of those where Rwanda isn't able to provide for their specific needs. It was always envisaged that would be a low number. There was no specific number associated with it. the presumption is that they would be relocated on the same terms as our resettlement, a UK resettlement agreement where we pay a tariff to local authorities as part of our wider UK resettlement scheme.
Sorry, Rwanda can't meet their needs, but the UK can.
It may be because there's specific medical needs, as is provided for under the Illegal Migration Act and under our inadmissibility rules. It may not be suitable for certain persons for a variety of reasons to be relocated to Rwanda. There may be, as we've had under our resettlement schemes, where there are people with particular vulnerabilities, where resettlement to the UK may be an important part of their long-term solution for protection. And that was the discussion on the agreement. As I say, we always thought that would be a small number of people. There have been no requests from Rwanda for us to resettle any individuals at this time.
So if we just concentrate on what you've just said, Mr. Hobbs, and take as an example medical conditions, what assessments has the department made on potential costs to the health service, for example, and cross-departmental costs?
That, under our UK resettlement scheme, as we did under Syria, we took the most vulnerable people. We have clear costs. There was an NAO report on the Syrian resettlement scheme, and we pay a tariff to local authorities that covers primary care and any other needs. So that is, if we include them under the UK resettlement scheme, there is a tariff that is paid per person for individuals. And as the Permanent Secretary set out, the government set out its intention around expanding and looking at options around safe and legal routes, and there's a report subject to the consultation with local authorities on capacity that is due later this year. So that work is already undertaken as part of our wider resettlement policy and approach that has been long-standing since the Syrian scheme was established.
One of the additional costs may include costs for training and development of Rwandan officials. And to go back to Mr. Lawton's earlier point around MICE and training representatives of MICE there, why are we paying for Rwandan officials to be trained? If we're entering a partnership with a third party, a third country, why are their officials not already trained?
I think I draw a distinction between the partnership between two sovereign governments, the UK and Rwanda on the one hand, and the commercial arrangement between the Home Office and, say, MIT on the other. The partnership between two sovereign countries is a partnership. It's something where both parties willingly come together because there are benefits for each of us. There are clear benefits for the UK. If there is a deterrent effect, there are clear benefits for Rwanda. One of the benefits for Rwanda is the investment in Rwanda's capability that the UK is paying in. So, which is why, in addition to the per-person costs, there are also UK payments into the Economic Transformation and Integration Fund, which is designed to improve Rwanda's capability. We want Rwanda to succeed. We want Rwanda to be a strong partner, able to be even more effective than it already is in working with countries like the UK on global challenges like irregular migration.
Just the final question from me, Chair, is, I mean, everything we've heard today, I don't know about colleagues, but for me, it just seems more opaque as the session seems to be going on, and the costs are quite eye-watering to date, with nobody having gone to Rwanda. How do you propose that any additional costs will then be reported back to Parliament and allow us to scrutinise?
First of all, you're absolutely right that the costs are very high. The reason that I required a ministerial direction 2 years ago was that at that time there was not evidence about value for money. That's why I have the ministerial direction. The costs are set out annually in our annual report and accounts, and of course on some occasions the department will bring costs earlier than that to this committee and to the Home Affairs Select Committee. And of course the National Audit Office report sets out very transparently the costs associated. The reason the reason that it's not all totally clear is that there are so many variables. We just don't know lots of things that are going to be very relevant to the total cost of this scheme. But we are absolutely committed to transparency and to making sure that this committee and its sister committee, the Home Affairs Select Committee, is able to hold us to account.
You spoke about the monitoring committee earlier, and it states that the joint committee will feed into the monitoring committee, who will have enhanced responsibilities to monitor the activities daily and ensure rapid response to any shortcomings. But that is only for 3 months. Why is that?
No, it's increased regularity at the very beginning, but it will carry on for the duration of the partnership. And the reason for that is that this is a novel scheme. We recognise that there is a very significant amount of risk in relation to this, but the government went down this route in the first place because there was such cost and risk associated with doing nothing.
Just so we're clear, the monitoring committee, would that be people from the UK sent out to Rwanda periodically? Look, or people based in Rwanda?
The joint committee to which the monitoring committee reports is officials. The independent monitoring committee are appointed independent officials that have been independently appointed, so they are not UK government officials. There are a mix of individuals of UK, Rwandan and Danish nationality that are on that committee with a range of expertise.
Danish, any particular reason for it?
One of the members is a Dane.
Okay.
Doesn't have to be Danish, it has to be someone else, not a non-UK Rwanda.
We're wondering about third countries. That would be another bit of a revelation at this late stage. I just wanted to quickly check on a couple of things before we move on to the longer term accommodation. When I raised at the very beginning, Sir Matthew, with you about the £50 million that's due, just to be clear, because there is a break clause, so if we talked about hypotheticals earlier, so we've done one set of hypotheticals. Let's go the other way. If the bill didn't pass this week, would that mean that the £50 million would not have to go to Rwanda if you didn't go ahead with the regime, or are you now committed to spending that?
I mean, I think yes, that is strictly speaking true. That if for whatever reason the bill did not go through, then it would be open to the UK government to press the pause button, and there is a pause button in the agreement, and that could lead then to the delay.
Okay.
But we're not anticipating
no,
that.
but I'm just saying,
that, but
it didn't kick in as a definite at the beginning of the financial year.
Exactly.
You still have the okay. That's just helpful to know. And then just also on the delay on the accounting officer assessment. Of course, you had a change of Home Secretary in November of last year, and yet from June to the November there was no release of the accounting officer assessment, and then from November to March. So was there a delay in getting it to the new Home Secretary at all for him to agree it, given that he would have had a lot on his plate as he arrived in the department? Was that part of the reason for the delay?
Well, I think there are a whole series of things, but I don't think there's sort of a particular reason for why it was published in March rather than in November.
Well, maybe our sister committee can raise that with the Home Secretary next time he's in front of them. Thank you for that. We're now going to move on to looking at the large sites. This is the alternative to hotel accommodation. I think we all agree having people permanently in hotels or long-term in hotels is not a good solution, but there are obviously issues around the large sites too. And I'm going to ask Dame Diana Johnson, MP, the Chair of the Home Affairs Committee, to kick off.
Thank you. Could we look at figure 7 of the report, please? And I particularly want to ask you, Sir Matthew, about the cost to set up these large-scale sites. It's the second column down on that figure 7. So it's on page 27.
We've got it.
Yep. So setting up the site and refurbishment was expected to cost around £5 million each for Wethersfield and for Scampton. Then if you move across to the latest analysis, it says the set-up costs have increased at both sites. Wethersfield is now expected to cost £49 million and Scampton £27 million. I just wonder, how is it you could get the figures so wrong?
It's a very good question. I first want to accept that we did get the figures so wrong. We were operating at pace. This is not an excuse, by the way, but just to set out the context of what was happening a year ago. There was a national emergency. There was a sense that we should be doing on this issue what our colleagues during COVID had done in terms of sort of pace of procurement and things like that. So we decided to press on as quickly as we could to increase the stock of total accommodation available to the UK government. And there wasn't other accommodation types available because all of the existing private rental market, even hotels, was already being used. And so we had to act in a novel and therefore in a quite a creative way looking at these sites. So we made an assessment about how much the setup costs would be, which in the case of both of those sites was woefully short. So there was a very significant optimism bias.
Optimism bias?
Well, a very significant optimism bias. And there was some...
Did anybody go and actually look at these sites and see what needed to be done to make them fit for asylum seekers to be housed there?
Yes, absolutely.
They did, and they thought 5 million was the correct figure for both.
They did, and they thought 5 million was the right figure for both. One of the things which is different from this sort of thing than, say, buying a house and doing a survey is that there are certain types of survey in this instance that can only be done when you have access to the site and people with the right expertise are able to get and look at, for instance, the very complex...
Right, but these were owned by the UK government?
There were so for instance there were sort of gas and electrical requirements, there were fire requirements which the Home Office was only able to access after our initial
Really? Sorry, you couldn't get the Ministry of Defence to let you have access before then?
Well, it turned out that we needed to get our own people in to look at those costs, and that is one of the reasons why the costs were...
So it's a national emergency, you've just said, and the government was desperately trying to find a way of housing people, and the MOD would not let you onto the site or let you find out what exactly needed to be done. So were you just sort of sticking your finger in the air and thinking, 5 million I'll solve the problems at these sites?
No, we were making a judgment under pressure and at pace. But we went through we went through a due process which involved the Treasury approving it as well. So it wasn't just within the Home Office. And it wasn't a finger in the air. It was an assessment based on what was known at that time and with that amount of time available, which subsequently, you're absolutely right, turned out to be massively under.
So what was the 49 million at Wethersfield? So what did you actually have to do at Wethersfield?
Joe might want to come in more detail. She oversees this programme, but I mentioned some of the things already. We had to look at a very complex gas and electrical setup. We had to increase from MOD standards to higher standards things like the fire resistance of the doors and of the ceilings and so on of some of the accommodation on the sites. We had to do remedial works. We had to remove asbestos. We had to improve security and install CCTV. We had, other unforeseen costs, which. Some of which we absolutely should have foreseen, but others which I think in practice it would not have been possible to foresee.
Well, you'd need security and you'd need CCTV. That's just a given, isn't it?
Exactly. So there's a mix of things there which I think were foreseen and then quite a lot of unforeseen things. But I just go back to the point I was trying to make at the beginning, which is that the government needed to find accommodation that was not previously available. So because we had to increase the total stock of accommodation in order to solve this problem, which is that we were spending too much on hotels.
Okay, but the MOD were obviously not wanting to really provide you with much assistance at that time.
Well, I think there was a reasonable level of cooperation with our MOD colleagues. But
okay. Well, I have to say we have looked at. I think our sister committee won't have. We have looked at defence accommodation, and it's not got a good record. It's in pretty poor condition. I wonder what your officials were doing. Did they believe what the MOD told them, or did they just, as Dame Diana said, did they actually visit some of these? Some of them were in a really poor condition.
They did visit, and that's what led to the judgment that £5 million would be a good estimate for the setup costs.
What were the skills of the officials that visited?
So I think that's key. When we undertook the initial surveys, there were the non-intrusive surveys into the site.
There were surveys. You had
there were
surveys.
There were pre-due diligence checks. It wasn't that nobody had visited the sites and no surveys were undertaken. It was the more intrusive surveys and detailed surveys that were undertaken post-purchase. And as Sir Matthew says, that's where some of the costs were unforeseen. However, it is very fair to say that we didn't have the right expertise on the programme at the time.
Okay.
And that's something we have now rectified, and we have recruited some very experienced programme directors as well as now more external advice.
Thank you for that honesty, Ms. Rowland. Ms. Dame Diana.
Sorry, I just want to be clear, non-intrusive. Does that mean you stand at the gate and you just kind of look at what's going on in the RAF base? Is that non-intrusive?
So some intrusive surveys actually contain damage to the property. So, for example, tracing asbestos, etc. We undertook that. But as I say, as Sir Matthew has set out, we were working at pace. It was a risk-based decision to do the intrusive surveys once we were on site and in ownership. If we had longer, I think we would have undertaken more surveys before purchase.
Okay, I want to ask you about the Bibby Stockholm, because we found out on the Home Affairs Select Committee that £22 million had been spent on obtaining the Bibby Stockholm and its mooring and everything else. And I wondered, Sir Matthew, could you just comment about the Bibby Stockholm and its value for money? It has an 18-month life, I understand, and the figures that you were working on the basis of full capacity would mean it would be value for money. Can you just update us today as to whether it is still value for money? Because I don't think you've ever got to full capacity.
That's correct. So we are operating on the basis that about 400 would be maximum capacity, and we have not reached 400 people on the Bibby Stockholm. The numbers do fluctuate, so that's why we don't give a running commentary. We have a plan to get up towards 400 by mid-June. You are also right that the initial contract is for 18 months with the possibility of renewal.
And are you satisfied it is value for money, considering you've spent 22 million getting the thing? You've not been able to put as many asylum seekers onto the barge as you were planning to. We know that the costs of hotels fluctuates, and that's part of your value for money assessment. Are you still satisfied it's value for money with all those sunk costs that you've had to put forward?
So the last time I made an assessment on this was in January, and the next one is due later this month because they're coming around every 3 months. And last time there was the net present value was positive, which means that it is value for money. I should clarify for the committee that the Green Book, the Treasury Bible that tells you how to do these things, says that you are supposed to not include sunk costs when you make your projection. It's supposed to be forward-looking only. So when you exclude the sunk costs, the Bibby Stockholm continues to be value for money. If that changes, either in relation to Bibby Stockholm or any of these other sites, then...
I'm just going to bring in the National Audit Office here, if I may. Mr. Lodge, who's the director responsible for this report. Oliver Lodge.
Sir Matthew's correct that if you're making a forward investment decision from a point in time, you would not want to consider the costs you've already incurred. I think the committee's questions about the quality of information on which those initial decisions were based are still very pertinent, though. And in our report, we zoom out and look at the value for money to the taxpayer as a whole, which incorporates everything that has been spent on these projects.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Could I just ask about Scampton?
Yes.
This is figure 9. This says approval to proceed granted on the basis of advice in March 23, expected end date for site July 25. Your initial estimate was cost £5 million less than using hotels, and it now says, updates in January, cost 45.1 million more than hotels with site used until March 28. Do you just want to talk us through that?
So, again, this is something which I review quarterly. At the last assessment in January, there was a net present value of plus 23 million, so again, demonstrating that it does represent value for money on the same basis that the NAO have just set out. There's a particular complication in relation to Scampton, which is about the numbers of people on the site. Now, of course, that's true of all of the sites. It's one of the variables that you'll be familiar with. In relation to Scampton, the original plan was to have a very significant number of people on the site, and that actually drove up the per person cost, because the only way to get that number of people on the site was through additional modular accommodation, which was actually costing significantly more per person than a scaled-back model. So what the Home Office has recently been discussing with the local authority is a smaller number, still hundreds, but hundreds rather than thousands of people on Scampton, which will actually increase the value for money because it'll decrease the per person cost, unusually.
So that was a mistake. to think that you could put thousands of people at RAF Scampton?
I again, in the spirit of what we were discussing previously, if we'd known then what we now know, then clearly we wouldn't have gone ahead the way that we did. But we were operating at pace in response to an emergency, and we were looking for ways to house as safely as possible the maximum number on this site. And it was through further work over the subsequent months that we realised that the modular accommodation in relation to Scampton was driving up the cost, and that therefore we should scale back to a smaller option.
On modular accommodation, I mean, were you competing in the same market as the schools that have got reinforced aerated concrete and have been buying temporary classrooms? Is that the same sort of supplier?
It could well have been.
I mean, I don't know about the details of all the different suppliers, but it's a very similar market.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful to know.
And just my last question. You say it was a national emergency. Obviously, the Home Office were using lots of hotel rooms and procuring hotels up and down the land. Ministers had decided, haven't they, that they wanted to get out of hotels for various reasons,
yes.
Cost and perhaps the perception. So it was a national emergency because ministers had decided to change what accommodation should be provided. That was the national emergency, was it? Just to be clear. Well, it wasn't that you'd run out of hotel rooms.
In 2022 and in 2023, there were a record number of people coming across the channel and claiming asylum. One of the things that was of concern to ministers, quite rightly, was the cost of the accommodation, because so much of it was in hotels, as well as the sense that in most communities, hotels are there for reasons other than to house asylum seekers. They're there for tourism or for conferences and so on. So I think it was reasonable for ministers to press officials to accelerate the move out of hotels, and I'm very glad to say that that programme is well on track to meet the targets that the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister have set out.
One option would have been to go after the backlog, wouldn't it? I mean, I know the backlog, the certain part of the backlog was being looked at, and more people were being taken on to deal with that. But resources could have been put into just getting rid of the backlog, rather than spending lots of money on large sites, which then proved to, on the whole, not to be value for money.
We've been doing that as well. It's not either or. There's no one single silver bullet here. We are seeking to tackle the complex challenge of this irregular migration, the numbers of people coming in claiming asylum in lots of different ways. There's the Rwanda partnership, there's partnerships with countries like Albania, there's the work with our colleagues in France and elsewhere, there's the increased number of caseworkers, there's the productivity, all sorts of different things. So it wasn't one or the other. We were doing both those things and many others at the same time.
We're going to move on now to Ms Barker.
Thank you, Chair. Matthew, we started the session with your accounting officer assessment of the Sovereign Borders Programme, and obviously we've heard that we will have an assessment on the Rwanda plan. And just to pick up on Dame Diana and also Mr Lodge's questions, the NAO Asylum Accommodation report in paragraph 3.3 clearly states the Home Office has incurred costs on plans that will not result in any additional accommodation. And taking into consideration that value for money is forward-looking, would it be fair of me to suggest to you that given the report states there will be no additional accommodation, that your report, your accounting officer assessment, should reflect that and reflect that there is no value for money?
So, first of all, you are absolutely right to highlight, as the National Audit Office report did, that there was some spending that the Home Office spent on sites which did not come to fruition. There are two types in particular. There's one at Linton-on-Ouse, and the other was additional barges like the Vivi Stockholm, but elsewhere. And those two strands of activity ended up costing 2.9 million and 0.5 million, respectively, before it was proven that those routes were going to be unsuitable. So there are absolutely lessons learned. The programme has already learnt the lessons from that in ways that Joe has already set out in terms of bringing in capability into the department that we previously didn't have. And that's been reflected by the IPA in its judgment of the most recent judgment of the programme, which has gone from red to amber, which means that it is now on stronger footing than it previously was.
Thank you. I think the committee will look forward to your accounting officer assessment.
Can I just, you mentioned the Green Book earlier. Did declaring this as an emergency mean that you didn't have to go through the normal processes in the Green Book?
No, we did go through the normal processes. We went through, so everything that we procured was through a normal contract, either.
It's just extraordinary that you spent money on something and then you realise you didn't need it. I mean, that's just...
Well, I think
use it.
I absolutely accept that there are lessons to be learned, but I think that in the scheme of things, when we were looking to create new types of accommodation that were not available, then putting some investment into different lines of activity is likely to create some spending that doesn't come to fruition.
Which is that the Home Office does do other asylum accommodation, and it takes a good 5 years to start planning the next contract. So,
Chair,
it's unbelievable, really, that it will happen so fast.
Chair, if I may, we didn't conclude in those two instances that we didn't need them. In terms of Linton-on-Ouse...
They weren't suitable.
In terms of Linton-on-Ouse, preferential bidder access by the MOD was withdrawn, and we moved away from it, and that was previous.
A preferential bidder access by the MOD. So the MOD sold it to a higher bidder.
No, it didn't give us preferential access to the land as is set out in the NAO report, so we couldn't get on there with the sorts of speed that we needed to stand up the accommodation. We absolutely did need additional accommodation for all the reasons that Matthew has set out, but we couldn't make Linton-on-Ouse work. We couldn't practically.
I'll get Mr. Lawton to pick that up. Mr. Lawton, over to you.
I'm just mystified about this huge mismatch between the estimate and the turnout cost for Scampton. Who was responsible for doing the non-intrusive pre-due diligence checks on that place?
We were doing the due diligence checks under the accommodation programme, which we had an SRO for that programme, and that fell under ultimately my leadership in the department.
So a member of your staff did those checks and made the assessment that 5 million was sufficient.
So we used, as is set out, a number of different contractors to support us to do those assessments. We made the best judgment that we could at pace. As Joe has said, since then we have brought a number of additional skills and capabilities into the team to make sure that we do have the sorts of property and facilities management.
Keep hearing this phrase "at pace." Cover up for the fact that it was catastrophically wrong. Now, why did the Home Office not look at its existing similar operations? You've been running the Napier Barracks, another MOD site, for 4 years. You faced similar challenges there. Surely you would have learnt some lessons in terms of likely outturn costs against the state of an existing premises, that you've had several years' experience of the pitfalls of it. Why don't you just send somebody to the Napier Barracks with some experience of having set that up, and then compare it with Scampton, for example?
So, I mean, we did have people in the department who were responsible and had set up Napier. I mean, as Matthew said, we're not using pace as an excuse. We know that we got those. No, it was part of the context.
Every response has included the term "at pace."
It's part of the context in which we were working. We have also said that we didn't have all the skills that we needed in the team, and we also said that we misjudged those costs, and in hindsight we can see that. And what we have done through the course of the year is continue to develop those sites so that we've got additional accommodation for asylum seekers.
I think the point I'm trying to make, Mr. Ridley, is this was not a first. You had experience of your department having to acquire at pace similar premises which you have been running for several years, which would have given you a fair idea of the costs of setting it up, converting it, and making it run. And yet you're treating Scampton as if it was a complete first, and therefore that explains why you were catastrophically wrong on the estimates. So it gives me no confidence that when you find an equivalent of Scampton that you have to do an at-pace assessment in the future, you're not going to make the same mistakes because you actually haven't looked at your experience of running existing comparable units. Why did this go so wrong? And are the people responsible for that still working in your team?
So, I mean, the issues we're talking about are not about running the sites. They're about the initial identification of the issues to set it up. Yeah. We absolutely have learnt from the running of Napier and the running of other sites and the running of Wethersfield and the work we're doing in Portland, and will in time do at Scampton, the issues in terms of the setup cost were a combination of not being able to get on site and do all the intrusive surveys that subsequently gave us further information, then a combination of not having all of the right skills in the team at the time to make an accurate assessment, and making the assessment that we made very quickly. We have said, and so Matthew has said, and Joe has said, we acknowledge we got that number very wrong. Some of that was definitely avoidable at the time. Some of it, I think, less so. Those are all lessons that we have learned in the programme, in the work we've done over the last year.
But you
such that we've now got the programme onto a much stronger
You didn't learn
footing.
them from Napier, because there were some set-up problems with Napier, which caused some additional costs.
If I might add, I think, if anything, the fact that we'd done Napier led us to assume that we'd have a similar path. These sites are very different. They've housed very different MOD purposes. They're in different parts of the country. For example, Scampton has its own private gas supply, which is proving quite difficult for us and requires different surveys. So I think the MOD sites, one of our big lessons is that they are very different. There have been surprises, there have been unforeseen costs, and they have not been easy to convert because each one is novel in its own right.
You're seriously saying that when Scampton was identified as a potential site, the MOD effectively denied you access?
No, we didn't say they denied us access. We did not do the intrusive surveys before we owned the site.
Why not?
Because we were operating at pace and we felt we had enough information based on the initial surveys.
So pace over value for money at this point. I'm going to bring in Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, who is, you might want to declare his interest here, actually.
Yes, I will declare my interest. I am a chartered surveyor. I used to work for the MOD as a chartered surveyor. I then went on to the private sector. And I have to tell you, Mr. Ridley, that all of these sites would have had basic information about the square footage of the buildings or the square meterage of the building, the size and type of gas supply, which you're complaining about now, the size and type of electricity supply you're complaining about now. There are mod drone technologies for doing surveys, which can be done in a matter of hours. Frankly, when I moved from the MOD to the private sector, we were doing complex property transactions of this type, where the clients, both purchaser and seller, wanted it within a week. If we had produced this sort of assessment that you've produced here so far adrift, we'd have been sued for negligence.
Have you got anything to say about the MOD's role in this?
The MOD did have information on the basic square footage of the buildings and those sorts of things. Absolutely.
Right. Just move on from the property point of view. And I bet you paid more than £5 million for the lease than anything else. So it was really, the sums just didn't add up at £5 million. But let's just move on from that aspect to the people aspect. When you bought RAF Wethersfield, and by the way, with the property aspects, the IPA, the Infrastructure Project Authority, 3 times gave a red assessment at various stages of this project. So if they could give you a red assessment, I don't know why the Home Office couldn't work out that it was wrong. But anyway, let's move on from the property aspects. When you purchased RAF Wethersfield, you originally calculated that you could accommodate 3,700 people there. It's actually turned out that you can only accommodate 800. So not only were your property aspects dreadfully wrong, your actual estimates of the number of people you were going to be able to accommodate are dreadfully wrong. And I assume that the same thing will be true at Scampton. You'll only be able to house 800 people. So that's 1,600 people on the 2 sites as opposed to 3,700 on the 1 site that you thought you were going to be able to accommodate. Is that correct?
So just to, if I may correct the first point, the original planning was for 1,700 on Wethersfield and 2,000 on Scampton. So you are quite right that 3,700 was in the initial planning, the total across the 2 sites. You are also correct that our current operations are to run Wethersfield at 800 with the ability to surge to a little over 1,200 if it is required, and that is in place. And similarly, we will reduce the number from, as Sir Matthew said earlier, at Scampton, and we're in the process of discussing the final plans with the local authority at the moment. The one thing there were lots of reasons for those change. Some about money, some about operational sort of capacity and safety. And we have determined with the current Home Secretary and Ministers that 800 is the right level for those two sites. We're also in a very different position this spring to the position we were in last spring, because we have successfully reduced new arrivals. We have successfully made a lot of initial decisions in terms of the backlog, and so we are able to close hotels. And we have fewer people on our estates than we did a year ago by a significant amount.
I'm sure we will want to come back at that at some stage, but time is moving on. Can I then take you to paragraph 5.8 on page 40 and talk about detention accommodation? And the final line or two of that paragraph, and has plans to increase this by 1,000 places by reopening centres at Haslar and Campsfield by the end of 2025, and expects to have capacity to detain over 3,500 people. Is this likely to be anywhere near enough, assuming that you could accommodate 3,500 people?
We mentioned this. We mentioned this earlier. This describes the plans we have underway to increase our detained accommodation. We may well need further detained accommodation, and we have been considering. We are considering options for that. But the timeline to build new detained accommodation is significant.
Well, no doubt keep us both committees updated on that aspect, please.
Of course.
Could I then take you to figure 11 on page 46? And this is all to do with the contracts. I note that there are 5 contracts there which were not submitted to competition. And those 5 amount to 243 million out of the total of 253 million. That's a pretty unsatisfactory procurement exercise, isn't it? Even though you'll no doubt tell me it was done in an emergency, at pace and everything else, but surely it would have been possible to have competed on a number of those contracts.
These were under framework contracts, so there was competition for the initial framework, and of course one of the purposes of having framework agreements in place is precisely in order to draw down from those frameworks at pace when there is an emergency, and so we were using those frameworks as a way of operating as quickly as possible within a context that had already been competed.
So you had a framework for each of these individual or a range of types of contracts that you might want to compete, and you just therefore then chose that firm at whatever price they put in under the framework?
There were a range of answers to that question, Sir Jeffrey. So we had the Crown Commercial Service framework, which we used for the Bibby Stockholm and for the modular elements at Scampton. We then, given the close working relationship with the Ministry of Justice and the fact that they provide property services Home Office, we used their contracts for Wethersfield and Scampton. And then we had existing contracts in place with our providers Serco and Clear Springs for the additional services at Wethersfield and Scampton. So 3 different types of answer to the question, but all of them were competed.
Well, of a sort. So let's just turn to the bottom line there, Scampton. At 72 million, not yet agreed. Why was it necessary to procure that under a framework rather than a full procurement exercise?
So I wonder if I could add a few things. So, first of all, we have existing relationships with the suppliers that, as Sir Matthew has said, were competitively tendered. We have good checks and balances in our contracts. So, for example, we have a profit cap over which they have to return a certain amount of profit. We regularly review the profit margins, and we have existing contract managers in place that understand the terms of the contracts in detail. To set up new contracts and add new suppliers into that, bearing in mind, and I realise the pace word has been used, but bearing in mind it was at pace, that would have added risk. However, the other thing to say is that this isn't a big market. So whilst at small scale, there are far more players in the market, at this scale, There is not a huge market that is available to us, and we are working with Crown Commercial Services to grow that market. So whilst it was existing contracts, it wasn't without checks and balances.
Well, the Scampton project, going back to that again, I imagine that the biggest part of that contract will be the security. Now, there are a number of firms that will supply this type of security. So it would have been possible, and it would still be possible, to fully compete that contract. It just seems to be a sort of practice that the Home Office has got into of procuring in this way, and I'm not sure it's achieving the best value for money for the taxpayer.
So full procurements do take some time, and they do need to be well thought through, and they do need soft market engagement followed by full market engagement. We haven't given any contractor exclusivity. We are still free to go to the market at any point with any of our contracts, either to introduce new players into it or to continue with some of the services already procured, or if we diversify into new sites. But this was the most appropriate, in our opinion, commercial avenue available to us at the time.
Okay, accepting that answer at face value for the moment, what I want to do, please, Mr. Ridley and Sir Matthew, is to get an assurance from you that when these contracts come to an end, and we don't know when they will come to an end, whether they are short or whether they are long, but if there is an opportunity, that they will be properly, fully competed for on renewal, rather than us just being renewed to the same contractor.
Absolutely, Sir Geoffrey. If I can just add one thing to what Joe was saying, our contract with, in this case, Serco, is to provide asylum accommodation in, broadly speaking, 1/3 of the country. And we use that contract reasonably. We adjust that contract reasonably, I think, in relation to changes in circumstances when what we need is additional or different accommodation for asylum seekers in that part of the country. So it's not as though we're doing one thing over here based on a contract over there. It's part of the original contract to provide asylum support services, including accommodation, in that part of the country. So I think there's a closer link between the original contract and this work than you are worried about. But I will absolutely ensure that where time permits, that we get the benefits of competition in this work.
And one final question from me, because I know the Chair is anxious to get the time. This link with the MOJ contract, I think, with Cushman and Wakefield in terms of procuring sites. Yeah. Can you just explain how that works? Because that looks to me as though a client was instructed to do one thing and was taken over by another department. Was it the same thing or was it different?
So Joe might want to add some detail, but I mean, we've worked very, very closely with the Ministry of Justice on all sorts of things, as you would expect, and they until very recently provided our property service anyway. So given it was a property issue, it was a reasonable thing to be using that route to get this contract.
No, that's absolutely right. It's a long-standing relationship. MOJ have a very experienced estates department. We've only used it insofar as the facilities management and, as you say, the initial services, so it's not that they provide wider accommodation services to us, but we benefit from their expertise and experience.
And the same for Kia. Kia
What a
PLC.
pity you didn't take them with you when you went to look at these new sites.
But that's the same for Kia PLC as well.
Yes.
And when it says that the money's not recorded by the Home Office, there was no additional cost. Is that not recorded because there was no additional cost, or is there a cost that we still got to find out from them?
I would need to double check that.
It is really, I mean, it's important that we find that out. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey. Matt Warman, MP.
Thank you. Sir Matthew, how many people have you got in hotels at the moment, and how many hotels, and at what cost to the taxpayer?
So all of those numbers are going down. You'll be glad to know. The latest number was 40,000 in hotels, and we are on track to. We've closed over 100, and the per person per night cost actually hasn't gone down yet. The total amount is going down. So we're now just less than £8 million per day, which is less than it previously was, even though it's still such a huge number. The per person cost is actually going up because we are removing people from hotels faster than we're closing down the hotels. So there are, just at the moment, we're paying for more unused bed spaces just at the moment, because there's a lag in terms of closing hotels. So the per person cost has gone up to £166 per person per night, and previously it had been in the range between 125 and 166. So we are expecting that 166 number to go down as we close more hotels.
And, I mean, in the last published statistics, it was 45,768 people in hotel contingency accommodation. That was at the end of December. We will publish the new number when we do the next set of statistics. It will be considerably down from that.
Bearing in mind the conversation we've just had about large sites, those numbers are not going down because people are being moved to Scampton or Wethersfield or anything like that. They're going down largely because the number of people being processed has gone up.
They're going down for a number of reasons. They're going down because we successfully reduced arrivals in 2023 by 36%, so that's fewer people coming into our system. We made all the initial decisions under the original...
Sorry, just to be clear, that's the Albanians who didn't, mostly down to Albanians who were sent back to Albania.
Well, it was
the weather.
We had far fewer people arriving last year through a combination of the work we did to deter Albanians by returning them every week, by the work we did with the French on the coast to interrupt arrivals, the work we're doing upstream to disrupt the supply chains and the other aspects of our approach. It is also because we made all the decisions under the legacy backlog, so that enabled people who were granted to leave accommodation. It is partly because of Project Maximise, where we identified another 11,500 bed spaces within the hotel estate, enabling us to close some of the hotels and reducing the cost. And it is because we have a number of people at Wethersfield and on the Bibby who would otherwise be in hotel accommodation.
But
they have a smaller number. You're quite right.
You've got 40,000 people in hotels and a much, much smaller number on large sites. So presumably, in the medium term, is the proportion of people in large sites expected to go up, or are we simply going to see a similar kind of proportion that means hotels are surely with us for quite a long time?
So, I mean, there are a number of variables in that. In that question, in terms of the numbers that affect the number of people we accommodate and the number of people we've ultimately got in hotels, we are continuing to seek to drive the number in hotels down through all the things we've talked about, also by seeking to increase the accommodation we've got in the dispersed estate, i.e. around the country, but because of the pressures on that part of the housing market, it's difficult to substantively grow. But our aim is to keep dropping the number of people in hotels as we go through the year. But that is subject to the variables that we've discussed.
And is it your view that the dispersal accommodation ultimately offers better value for money for the taxpayer, or is it that it is putting lesser tensions on local communities?
So dispersal accommodation is cheaper than hotel accommodation per person per night. There are also advantages of in terms of sort of spreading people through different communities, but also, as we've said earlier, hotels have different functions in the economy, and bringing them back into active use is beneficial.
Yes, I had 6 hotels in my constituency that were being used. I'm now down to 1, which is obviously progress. It is unfortunately the biggest hotel on the seafront in Skegness, so it has a sort of dominant presence. Can you give me a sense of when someone like me is likely to be able to say there are no hotels used for this purpose in their constituency?
I think it's very difficult to put a time on that because of the uncertainties. It will depend on all the things that we have been discussing in these 2 sessions today.
There isn't really much light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, we've successfully closed over 100 hotels. We are continuing to close more, and we will do all the work that we are doing. We hope to be able to get to the point where we can bring hotels and communities back into active economic use as much as possible, but I can't put a date on that, Mr. Warman.
Where you've talked about, you've got at the moment a sort of a big buffer of the number of rooms that you're paying for versus the number that are actually being used. Presumably we can expect another wave of hotels to be closed relatively soon. What's a comfortable buffer for you? How can we think about value for money for the taxpayer and for those communities? Because it's obviously even worse for a local community to know that the taxpayer is funding an empty hotel in some ways than it is paying for one that is being used.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we have said before, and as I think is in the NAO report, we hold a buffer of around 5,000 beds to enable us to make sure we can move people through Manston quickly when there are arrivals. At the moment, as Sir Matthew has said, we have a larger number of empty beds. That is in large part because of the operational necessities of closing hotels, where we have to obviously move everybody out of a hotel we're going to close, but then we only close it at the end of the commercial agreement that we have got, which means we hold a number. So that will reduce as we continue to go through the programme, and it's certainly not our intention to be holding hotels empty at
and could those contracts that mean that you have to keep paying those bills have been better negotiated so that we didn't see this hold up, do you think?
I mean, we have break clauses usually of 3 months. It varies in terms of different hotels. We are, as I have said, dealing with quite considerable uncertainty in terms of the numbers, and those are the sorts of lead times that strike a balance between the sort of flexibility that we need and the sort of commercial realities of the discussion.
You're obviously right to talk about the value of hotels to local communities doing the job that they should be doing rather than acting as hostels or whatever you want to call them for your purposes. What consideration have you or other departments given to the cost of that to local communities in terms of social cohesion and all that? Because when I think about the hotels that are now empty in Skegness, they are an eyesore. They are doing significant damage to the local economy, because where people used to phone up hoteliers and say, how close are you to these hotels I've heard about, and then cancel their bookings if they turned out to be next door. Now you've got people saying, well, you wouldn't want to book that one because it's next to, as I say, an eyesore. That is your fault, isn't it?
So, I mean, to your first question, I mean, we have done a lot of our assessments around hotels and value for money on the per person per night costs. But you are quite right that there are wider disbenefits in local areas to have hotels out of their economic use and indeed broader community impact, certainly in some cases. That is something we have looked at. It's very hard to quantify, but we have got work underway to continue to assess that. And as we've said, the aim of our policies and operations in this approach is to minimise the number of hotels that we are using, and ultimately, hopefully, to stop using them.
You'll have read, just finally, you'll have read reports of people specifically buying up hotels that were essentially distressed assets to take advantage of the schemes that you were proposing. Have you done any work on those what you might call rogue landlords and the potential for them to be not only taking advantage of the money that was on offer from the government, but also to be the worst kind of landlords for people when it comes to returning those hotels to their intended purpose? Because you are potentially putting real burdens on local communities or on future owners. And so I suppose, is your assumption that when these hotels are in a real state, they'll be picked up cheap and refurbished and it's none of your problem? Or do you think that the Home Office has a responsibility to those communities?
So within my team now, we have liaison officers working directly with every local authority, because as you know, each local authority area has different challenges. Each return of every hotel will have different meaning. We've also, that is part of our assessment when we're closing hotels and in what order to close them. So whilst the Home Office can't take responsibility for the whole housing market, and obviously that across government we work with DLUC and other departments to manage the wider issue of housing and landlords, we are not cloth-eared to the the issues that local authorities face, and we are in direct liaison with local authorities in a way that perhaps in the early days we were not.
What does that mean in practice, though? Does that mean there's potentially money on the table for restitution, or is there a possibility that you wouldn't close a hotel if you thought it might do more harm as a eyesore on the seafront? What does a liaison officer do?
So ultimately, we can only spend the money that's within the purpose of the department to spend. However, we're not doing it in isolation of the local authority. We're doing it at a pace that the local authority can manage, and we're also doing it with consultation with the community. All local authorities now have a place-based visibility tool where they can see all the accommodation occupied, whilst it's not the personal details of them, but every asylum seeker housed within their local authority area and the type of accommodation they're in. So we are working in partnership as far as we're able to.
I'm still not clear what that partnership means other than managing a timeline. It doesn't seem like it's going to do anyone any good when it comes to trying to get those hotels back to the state they were in before they were used for this purpose. Can you put some flesh on the bones of what good it might actually do?
So it's obviously we do not have a pot of money to regenerate hotels. What we can do, though, is make sure that we are working with the local authority so that they understand the timing and they can understand their own, within their local town planning, they can factor in the return of assets or hotels within their area.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warman. Rowland, the MP.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk a bit about the safety of asylum seekers in the large sites. It's a concern I've had for the hotel in my constituency. I had a lot of complaints, both via the local authority and directly from residents in the hotel, principally about the state of the food that they were being served, but other concerns as well. And now it's here in Figure 10 in the report. Some, really quite grave concerns about safety of residents on the Bibby Stockholm and at the Wethersfield site. My experience when I was trying to engage the Home Office in my concerns about the hotel in my constituency was it had all been outsourced to a contractor, and that it was really very, very difficult to get engagement on how things could be improved. Can you tell me, Sir Matthew, what's being done to really address the concerns around health and safety of residents at these large sites?
First of all, sorry to hear about the concerns within your own constituency. If you would like to take those up separately, of course, we will do that.
Hotel, as I've now informed, is no longer hosting asylum seekers, so, but that is why my concern is now transferred to these sites rather than my own constituency.
Secondly, there are some benefits from the perspective of the asylum seeker of being in a large site rather than in a hotel, and those include, for instance, access to healthcare without having to, if you like, join a queue with the local community. There is often a specific provision for the large site, and there are also benefits in terms of sort of efficiency of asylum interviewing and so on. So there are some benefits to the large sites as well as some disbenefits. And thirdly, the Home Office does run all of this accommodation through suppliers. So that doesn't mean that we're hands off, though. We run it through the suppliers. The suppliers have the primary responsibility of providing, for instance, food of the right standard, but we manage those contracts through the arrangements that Joe has set out in ways that hold our suppliers to account. So when there are concerns, as we have heard, about quality of food or indeed anything else, whether it's healthcare provision or security or anything else, then we pursue those vigorously with our suppliers.
The report says that there have been 283 incidents of suicide or self-harm specifically related to room sharing. What are you doing to address that particular issue?
This is a very significant issue, as you would expect. So we make sure that, first of all, there is screening of each individual asylum seeker before they are moved on to a large site or indeed into a hotel. If they are sharing a room, then we make sure that they are suitable for sharing a room and that the person they're sharing with also, so that we don't create any additional pressures. And then thirdly, if nevertheless, despite those steps, there are still incidents that happen or tensions that arise, then in each site there are signposted ways for each of those people to take up their concerns.
And to what extent is the health and welfare of the migrants an objective? Is it a greater, equal or lesser objective than the cost of providing a space?
It's baked in to the way that the Home Office provides accommodation and the way that the Home Office runs our contracts with our commercial suppliers. So there is a minimum standard that the suppliers have to uphold in order to ensure that each individual has those rights protected.
And is there a financial penalty to your contractors if they don't?
Yes. Yes, there are clear KPIs on the safety and the I was going to say it being habitable of the accommodation. We have, as you'd expect, regular contract management and governance meetings where we scrutinise the KPI returns from our suppliers. So that is absolutely baked into the contract. At Wethersfield and Bibby, we also have on-site health services that are open Monday to Friday in both cases, essentially all day. I think it's 10 to 6 at Wethersfield and 9 to 5 at Bibby. The providers have welfare teams on site. We have also at the large sites got a senior member of staff on site who work with the police locally and so on.
And finally, have those financial penalties been invoked in relation to the incidents listed here in Figure 10, the identification of Legionella bacteria on the Bibby Stockholm and the detection of infectious diseases at Wethersfield?
I don't have all the detailed commercial, but we have been through those instances with our providers.
Would you be able to let the committee know what financial penalties were invoked in relation to those?
Happy to let you know any facts within kind of commercial confidentialities of the contract.
Thank you,
Chair. Very much, Ms. Olney. Matt Woolman, MP.
Just picking up on some of those healthcare issues, one of the reasons it's particularly inappropriate to house people in hotels in Skegness, for instance, is because the local NHS is not set up for people with those sorts of problems that we've seen with asylum seekers. But it is surely, from what you're saying, the case that the provision of healthcare services on the large sites is not just right for those people, but it is a massively higher standard and a lower waiting list, for instance, than it would be for typical constituents. Is that what you're really saying, and is that a conscious decision that comes from the department?
No. What we're saying is that in order to ensure that we are not adding unnecessarily to the burden which is already strong in a local community, Portland in relation to Bibby, for instance, we are instead providing a bespoke service for the asylum seekers in that site. That doesn't mean that we are aiming to give them preferential access. It means that we are seeking not to have a negative impact on the local access.
But you are giving them a higher standard of care than everyone else could expect.
We're providing the standard of care that is appropriate for their circumstances, which, as your colleague was suggesting, sometimes they are more vulnerable than average. So sometimes it would I think make sense for them to have that. Yes.
Does that mean that in some ways you're suggesting that the standard of care for Joe Public, for want of a better word, is below what it should be?
No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that asylum seekers on some sites have some needs which are better provided by a bespoke service for the people on that site in order to detract from the existing service for the existing customers of that service, i.e. the local inhabitants.
But I think we've heard, for instance, that the wait at Wethersfield to see a GP was about an hour, which is great, and I know every one of my constituents would think that was excellent, but that's not what's available. How well do you think you're calibrating what is on offer for people where the need might genuinely not be that urgent?
Well, on the basis of this last 10 minutes, we've got one person who thinks we're doing too much and another who thinks we're doing not enough. So
that's unfair characterisation. It's a fair question from Mr. Warman. How do you decide what resource to provide?
We're not seeking to provide an unnecessarily luxurious amount of support in any sense, whether that's for healthcare or food or anything else. But we are seeking to provide an appropriate amount for people to live in dignity.
Because I think what you've actually heard to characterise what we're saying is that you're not serving the most vulnerable people as well as perhaps you could be, but you are doing the low-hanging fruit too well, if that makes sense. The GP appointment shouldn't be your top priority. It should be the most vulnerable people, surely. And this is a failure of provision, surely.
Those incidents reported in the NAO report, they are not necessarily all incidents of self-harm. We have a migrant helpline that's available to all asylum seekers, whether they're in a large site or dispersed accommodation. That's 24/7. We also have, within all of our contracts and the 400 plus staff I directly employ in accommodation services, all looking for any concerns around welfare or safeguarding. And if a concern is raised, an incident is raised so that we can act accordingly. So we definitely look for equitable care between the two. Any bed occupied within the local authority area, the local authority gets £3,500 in acknowledgement that it is extra population on their services within their area. However, large sites could have a disproportionate burden, which is why it's appropriate we put our own additional healthcare services in there.
But for instance, just finally, for instance, NICE or various different bits of the Department for Health have what they think are reasonable standards for people to have to wait for a GP appointment or a dentist appointment or whatever. None of that is an hour.
So I think it's very important to acknowledge that the asylum-seeking population is not typical to the population of the UK. Many are coming from very traumatic experiences and backgrounds. Some may have particularly acute health problems that need urgent treatment, and indeed it's important that
wouldn't
does
go to
get
a
treated.
GP for urgent treatment.
So no, I'm just suggesting, and therefore it's not a comparable population with regards to the population of the UK.
I mean, it's also worth saying we made the judgments on the services in concert with local public service providers and also with national health colleagues in terms of the decisions around
certainly one of those,
around large sites. And
one of the challenges of hotels was that actually people often arrived at short notice.
Yes,
and put an extra burden on local.
And that was a particular problem through 2022 and early 2023, and the work that Joe has described in terms of the information we provide.
Can I just ask then finally, where do you get these GPs from? Because we haven't got that many GPs. That
is a question for the local health service. I mean, we work with them and provide funding to the health service. Yeah, it's not a home office.
But you are providing funding.
Provision.
You are paying directly for the GPs that provide this. It's not a normal NHS service paid for. You are paying extra. Okay. Thank you. Jonathan Ginogli, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I'm slightly confused here. So we've been talking about closing hotels, that's less spaces. We've been talking about opening large sites, that's more spaces, although the large sites are going to have less spaces than we thought. So what is the number of detention spaces actually needed to operate the asylum system?
I mean, first thing to say is this we're talking about non-detained accommodation, just to be completely clear.
Going back to Mr. Lawton's earlier question.
I mean, the answer depends on a whole set of variables. So there's not a point number I can give. It depends on the number of people arriving, how fast we make decisions, what those grant rates are, how many people appeal, etc. So it's a sort of, there's a very complicated set of variables. What we tried to do is assess on a set of assumptions and sort of significant sensitivities around that what we think we need, and it is on that basis that we concluded in October we expected the population to go down and we could start closing hotels, and that is what we're doing. I mean, it's worth saying, you're right, we're opening new beds on large sites, but the total number of the total population in the Home Office estate is going down at the moment. That's the current direction of travel.
You'll have enough for what you need.
We have got enough for what we need right now, and a little bit more, as we have discussed. And what we're trying to do is get the right balance between what we need and the supply that we've got, so we're not overburdening communities or spending more than we need to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Schnockley. I just wanted to go back briefly before we finished, Ms. Rowland, about the liaison officers that you talked about. And we've had in this committee in the past evidence from colleagues about the lack of a liaison between the Home Office and local authorities. So if that's working well, then that's a good move. But there are issues around data sharing and homelessness. There's a lot of we've had evidence for this and previous hearings that when you're moving people out of hotels, when you're then also going through the backlog and people are getting their assessment, they're often needing to be put into temporary accommodation by the local authority. Sometimes they're bidding for the same hotel spaces or temporary accommodation as you. So how are your liaison officers actually making a difference there, or are they yet?
So there's three things we've done in this area, because you're absolutely right. It is a challenge that local authorities face. So first of all, I've already mentioned that we have the visibility tool for every local authority. We've also introduced a safeguard to make sure that when a decision letter is issued, the local authority are notified. And previously that was always the case. It wasn't happening reliably. And so we've now got a safeguard.
For the family amnesty, though, I think the Home Office would like to put the family resettlement scheme of 15, 16 years ago, or longer than that, I think, but local authorities were notified then. So it had been there and it hadn't been working very well. Now you've reinstated it as a more effective.
There were reports from some local authorities that it wasn't reliable enough, so we've put safeguards in there. The second thing we've done, we've worked with the DWP, and as you may know, it's 35 days before an initial universal credit payment is made. Once we offer we issue the biometric residency permit, which isn't instantly at point of decision, it's a short time after, but there is 28 days within our accommodation. In order to not wait for the biometric residency permit, we've made arrangements with DWP that they will accept the decision letter as evidence, so they can start their universal credit claim early and access the necessary benefits. Finally, we also are offering a transition loan that is paid back through benefits eventually, but it's paid by us to asylum seekers to help them make that transition from our support into the communities.
So are you therefore asking some of those people to make their own decisions and find their own housing? Or surely because they're suddenly out there with legal status but with nowhere to live, they will fall upon the local authority?
So we're doing an awful lot whilst they're in our accommodation to help with that transition, and at the point of decision, we're also offering extra services and education to asylum seekers about what it means to live in society, how they access benefit services, run houses, pay bills.
Okay, so at the point of decision, from point of decision to when they have to leave the temporary accommodation, the hotel or wherever they're in with you, how long is that?
So it's 28 days for when the biometric residency permit, but how long between decision and that being issued can vary.
Well, I just have to say, I mean, it's not related to this, but I had a case of somebody whose case was decided it took 6 months for the case to be for her to be sent a letter, and another 6 months, or I think maybe even longer, for her to receive 6 months for her to be notified, and then she still has not received her biometric residency permit. So there's been a slowness in the system. So are all these asylum seekers getting their biometric residency permits in a reasonable period of time? What's your average time for issuing it from decision to issuing?
It's a matter of a week or so normally, and then the 28 days. That sounds an unusual case, and as Sir Matthew said, any individual cases you've got.
Well, right, it's not to do with this, but it's interesting that you can do it in a week, but other people who in this country trying to live their legitimate life. They've gone through everything legally and still can't get it and can't work without it. Anyway, well, that's helpful to know. But local authorities also have to pay for planning costs on the sites, and we've had some evidence from West Lindsey District Council in particular on that. I would thank all those who've given evidence. Have you thought, well, that's quite a big issue. It's a big, expensive thing. Suddenly, an empty, derelict site turns into something. There's a lot of money for a local authority. Some of these are small districts, cash strapped. Have you considered providing any support and funding for them?
Local authorities get the money as people come on site.
It is just the 3,000 per head.
Yeah, 3,500 per bed.
And we are in the case of West Lindsey District Council, we're in active discussions with them about the regeneration of the site. It is fully our intention to see that site developed in future, particularly because of its heritage status. And so all of that is still subject to discussion. It's very early in those discussions.
Well, I think we haven't got time to go into that, but I'm sure the local MPs will. And just finally, Sir Matthew, you called for ministerial direction on the Rwanda scheme. On this, we've gone into detail about the costs and how they've escalated. And you've talked, I think we had a £10 for every time you'd each, all between you'd mentioned the word pace. We would probably be having at least a slap-up meal. So did you not consider a ministerial direction for the pace at which you had to deliver these large asylum sites, which are still mostly not delivered?
I did consider that, and I decided that in each case it was feasible.
So you took each site separately?
That's right, as well as the programme as a whole. And then, as I mentioned before, I'm looking every quarter, and next time later this month, at all of the accounting officer tests. If any of them, particularly value for money, but if feasibility as well, if any of them were to turn negative, then I would have to say to the Home Secretary that we will need to exit that site, or to continue, you would need to give a ministerial direction. So that's something which is sort of a live issue in the Home Office as some of the variables fluctuate.
Okay, so it's a live issue. That's helpful to know. Look, I think we've had a long session, partly because we were covering obviously two important pieces of work from the National Audit Office, and I thank them for their work in providing that and on this important scheme, which of course is about to be before the House today with Lord's amendments, the bill in question on Rwanda. This isn't an issue that's going to resolve itself overnight. We're aware of that, but hopefully we've teased out some of the issues about cost and resilience on this. We'll continue to look at it along with our sister committee. Our colleagues have hopped off to the chamber to question ministers directly about it, and we will be producing a report on this probably some point after the May recess, or maybe maybe before the May recess with a fair wind. We're trying to keep up our pace. So I thank our witnesses, Joanna, Rowland, Simon Ridley, Sir Matthew Rycroft and Dan Hobbs, very much indeed for their time. The transcript will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and many thanks to our great colleagues at Hansard for that. Thank you very much indeed. Order.
Has ended. The proceeding 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 has ended. The proceeding